And now, at last, Odysseus was on his way home. But getting home was never going to be easy. Odysseus has finally reached the shores of Ithaca, but before we reach the end of this review, there is one final question to answer. How does Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey actually measure up? In part 1, I looked at the first half of Nolan's The Odyssey, his interpretation of Homer's epic, which included some of the changes to the story, the characters, the mythology, and the overall tone of the film. Now it's time to put the film under the microscope. How faithful is it to Homer? How does it stand up historically? What about the costumes, the ships, the weapons, the music, and the visual design? Does the film actually capture the world of the Bronze Age? Or does it feel like a modern Hollywood interpretation wearing the clothes of an ancient epic? And perhaps most importantly, does Nolan's The Odyssey actually understand what makes Homer's story an epic? I'll be scoring each element of the film and at the end giving my final rating. This is part 2 of the Odyssey Files, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey review, Modern Myth, Modern Interpretation or Misplaced Meaning, part 2. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you are a repeat listener, welcome back. On tonight's episode, we're going to be continuing our very epic look at Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. I'll be picking this episode up where we left off in part 1. So if you haven't listened to part 1, I recommend you go ahead and do so. This episode will cover the rest of the film review. We'll also be putting the film under a microscope and looking at every element and part of the film in detail. I'll be scoring the film out of 5 in every different element of the film, from music, costume, historical accuracy, faithfulness to Homer, direction, acting. Every part of the film will be looked at in detail, examined, and given an overall rating. It's going to be another epic show. There's a lot to cover, so without further ado, let's get into tonight's episode. This is episode 111 of The Truth Tank, The Odyssey Files, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey review, Modern Myth, Modern Interpretation or Misplaced Meaning, Part 2. So Telemachus is still with Menelaus. There's a scene of these two hunting quail or something in a field, in an olive field by the look of it. And it appears that Telemachus and Menelaus are wearing attire better suited to a Robin Hood movie. Menelaus has like a red, it looks like a long sleeve hooded t-shirt with a tie neck. The kind of clothing you associate more with the medieval period than the late Bronze Age. Telemachus is wearing like a white version of that with this very modern looking armour with this straight triangular kind of pattern on the abs and the chest. So Menelaus is filling in Telemachus more about Troy, which is not like the source material at all. Telemachus leaves Sparta, but not before Helen tells Telemachus that she is sorry for the dead. I think she asks him to pass along a message to his mother saying she is sorry for all the pain that she has caused. So back in Ithaca, Penelope is weaving a shroud. It's a death shroud. She's at the loom. The loom plays a big part of Penelope's story. She, as you know, if you're making anything on the loom, it takes months to complete. She is at the loom for a long time making this shroud. Every night she undoes her work to buy herself more time with the suitors. Antonius figures this out and confronts her in her room, where she tells the handmaiden to leave. She is weaving. The death shroud is intended for Odysseus' father. When he dies, he's to be buried with this shroud, which kind of doesn't make sense in this context because Odysseus' father isn't in Nolan's version. But she's supposed to finish that, then she's going to start another shroud, which is going to be a wedding shroud, and when she finishes the wedding shroud, she will pick a suitor. So the suitors are getting annoyed that she's taking so long, and she keeps tiptoeing around the question. So this is a way to maintain control and to further manipulate the suitors. And it's during this scene we see the treachery of the servants, but ultimately this isn't really well explained, or which servants can be trusted and which cannot be. The servant that Mia Goth plays is feeding Antonius information about what Penelope is up to. She also tells Antonius that Telemachus is on the way home, because word has reached that Telemachus has left Sparta or something. She also tells him that, I'm pretty sure she tells him also that Telemachus is leaving, because he hasn't made it public, he has just left. And that's where Antonius comes up with his plan to murder Telemachus on the way back to Ithaca. Once again, if this was better explained, I think this would have had more of an emotional impact. And that's the other person I haven't really mentioned in the cast is Mia Goth, because her character literally has no impact on this film whatsoever. She has, I think, 2 or 3 lines in the entire film, and it kind of seemed like you could have gotten anybody to play some of these characters. They just went for the big names, which I think some of these characters would have been better if they were played by lesser-known actors. So Odysseus is on the high seas. He tells the crew about the sirens and how they have to block their ears with beeswax, but Odysseus wants to hear the siren's song. He instructs the crew to tie him to the mast and not to let him go. They come close to the island. He hears the siren song and starts to scream and go insane. Now, the random Korean member of the crew, because whatever reason there's a Korean guy on the ship, he takes the beeswax out of his ear and jumps overboard to go swim to the island of the sirens. You don't really see the sirens. They're kind of shrouded in mist on these rocks. And this is kind of a cool scene because you're seeing it from the perspective of Eurylochus. You don't really hear the siren song, which I thought was an interesting creative choice as well, but one that kind of pays off. Because you hear it from the perspective of him having his ears blocked, but you're seeing Odysseus screaming and crying because this song is so beautiful, or also so terrifying. It tells you what you want to hear and what you desire, but also it's horrifying at the same time. And Matt Damon does a really good job of trying to convey that, because it wouldn't have been the easiest thing to try to portray. So once the ordeal with the sirens is over, there are still 2 more massive obstacles to face. There's 3 big challenges right in a row: the sirens, the whirlpool, and the rocks. So now the crew faces Charybdis, or the whirlpool. Eurylochus wants to go around the whirlpool, but Odysseus says, no, we have to go through the canal with the rocks, because if we head to the whirlpool, we'll all be killed. If we go to the rocks, we'll be safe. Now, the metaphor, or the logos in this one, is pretty obvious. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Sulla and Charybdis. Also turns out that it's actually a real place. It's the spot in between Sicily and Italy. Sulla, Sicily; Charybdis, Calabria, southern Italy. Apparently the currents are pretty strong. A lot of ships get wrecked along there before people figured out what was happening. Don't quote me on it, but I'm pretty sure I heard that on a documentary somewhere. So anyway, they narrowly avoid Charybdis. Now they head for Sulla. They're making their way through the narrow canal before 6 of Odysseus' crew are picked up and killed by this giant tentacle monster. I really didn't like the design of this. Sulla is supposed to be, I think, like a dog-headed creature or a snake-headed creature or something like that. And Nolan's decided to go with this like ambiguous kind of like tentacle-looking thing with a mouth on it. It's not very inspired or creative. The tentacles pick up the crew, eat them, and then retract into the rocks. It was also obvious CGI too, and it wasn't good CGI either. The tentacles looked fucking terrible. And there's not a hell of a lot of... Well, I mean, there are visual effects in this film. I don't care what anyone says. I don't think Nolan has said there was no visual effects in it. I think there was a bigger focus on practical effects over visual effects. But there is obviously visual effects in the film because you couldn't have done the whirlpool or Sulla without them. So Eurylochus confronts Odysseus. He says, you knew that was going to happen. You knew men were going to get killed. And he explains, it was 6 men or it was all of us. We had to do it. We would have been smashed to pieces in the whirlpool and everyone would have been killed. Eurylochus argues and says, we could have gotten out of it. He says, no, it was prophesized. It was 6 men or everyone. So there's a bit more of this back and forth between Odysseus and the crew. Once again, no real tension here. So from there, Eurylochus spots land. Odysseus wants to keep going, but the crew are demoralized, they're hungry, and they kind of had enough of life on the high seas. So Odysseus agrees to land the ships on the beach. The winds blow them ashore, and they end up staying on this beach for a month because the wind keeps blowing in that direction, and it's preventing them from going back out to the ocean and continuing their journey. Now, they land on this island. It's full of cattle, so the temptation to eat is always there, but Odysseus was warned this is Hyperion's island and the cattle belong to Hyperion. If anyone eats one of the sun god's cattle, the whole crew is doomed and your ships will be destroyed. So Odysseus obeys this, and this lines up with the book. But unfortunately, the crew disobey orders. They kill one of the cattle and barbecue it. Odysseus sees the glow of a fire. He approaches the crew. He's not actually even shocked that they've done this because I think he kind of anticipates that they are going to do it. Odysseus confronts the crew and says, did you think if you had the fire in a pit that the sun god wouldn't see it or something like that? So from there, Odysseus realizes that they're basically fucked. Odysseus heads back to the ship where he is confronted by Athena. She slightly blames him for what has happened, and we get another flashback to the Trojan War. And it's around here that you start to question, is Athena actually a goddess in this film? Or is she less of a goddess and more of a hallucination or a vision due to Odysseus' traumatic past? Because she doesn't really act like a goddess. She's not really in it a hell of a lot either. And unlike the source material, she doesn't really have a huge impact in the story, which she's the guide through the entire film. So the wind changes and the crew take this opportunity to take the ships back out to sea. In other words, the gods have lured Odysseus and his crew out to sea and to their deaths. Not long after, the ship gets hit by a massive storm that destroys the ship. It splits it in two. Odysseus is separated from his crew. They're wrecked out at sea. And Odysseus washes up on a beach, which is Circe's island, which is Calypso's island. She fixes his body, but as she says in the film, she couldn't really fix his mind, or she couldn't fix his mind fully. She tells him to stop eating the lotus, and he starts to regain his memory and blames her for keeping him there against his will. It's kind of implied in this scene that he is suffering from PTSD and the traumatic side effects of war. And as I just mentioned about Athena, there's an earlier scene where Odysseus is talking to Athena on the beach. She disappears and Calypso says, "Who are you talking to?" And Odysseus replies, "Athena came to me." And the scene on Hyperion's island kind of confirms that she isn't really real. Well, she's real to him, but nobody else. So is Calypso real, or is Calypso also a figment of Odysseus' imagination? Is it like a Fight Club kind of a thing happening, where she is just a projection? Because as is revealed, Odysseus has spent 7 years on this island living with Calypso. So, while this is all happening, Telemachus is returning home to take back his throne. The plot to kill him unfolds. Mia Goth's servant girl tells Antonius Telemachus is coming back. I'm not sure how the servants would have known that. And that he has been to Sparta. So Antonius dispatches basically like a hit crew to kill Telemachus on the road back to Ithaca. The hunting party confronts Eumaeus in his hut. They kill his guard dogs, which I thoroughly disagree with. But once again, I think this would have been a bit more impactful if a bit more time had gone to the suitors, because these guys are kind of just randoms. It's not Antonius or any of the ones that have had more screen time. It's just a group of new suitors. And not all the suitors were bad, obviously. Some of them were worse than others. There's probably some factions going on in between them as well. But a bit more time to maybe individualize or personalize some of the suitors would have been nice, but at the same time, it's already a 3-hour film, and if anyone was going to get cut out of the story, it would have been the suitors, because while they play a important part of it, they're not the main focus. The suitors' plan is to kill Telemachus and cover it up. They're going to do whatever they can to prevent him from coming back to Ithaca and taking back the throne. In the meantime, Odysseus is making a raft from pieces of driftwood from his ship. He's been on the island with Calypso for 7 years, and as Calypso explains to him, he's going to have to take a leap of faith and trust the gods if he wants to get back home, which he does. He braces storms. He's getting tossed around on this piece of driftwood in the ocean like Tom Hanks in the end of Castaway, before washing up in a beach in Ithaca. He wakes up to find Athena there, who tells him that he is home. He doesn't recognize his home. At first, it's shrouded in fog, which is consistent with the book, but at the same time, it differs from the book because he gets a ride home via the Phoenician king. The Phoenician king provides him with a boat and treasure and drops him off in Ithaca. And once again, he falls asleep, and he's placed under a tree near the beach, where he wakes to find Athena. Telemachus is on his way home. He has returned a very different person from when he first left. He leaves a boy and he returns a man, ready to take back his kingdom. Odysseus makes his way to Eumaeus' hut, where he fills him in about the plan to kill Telemachus. Eumaeus doesn't know he's Odysseus yet. Odysseus heads out to intercept the hunting party before they can reach Telemachus. So Telemachus and Mentor find themselves on the docks of Ithaca. They make their way to Athena's temple. I have a bit of a theory about the Athena statue too, because you see several Athena statues in the film. One's decapitated in Troy and the other is in Ithaca. The statues don't resemble Zendaya at all. Zendaya looks completely different to the statues of Athena. You would think if she was Athena, wouldn't the statues look like her? Which I think confirms that the Athena Odysseus interacts with is a hallucination, more than anything. It's during this scene in the temple that Telemachus and Mentor are approached by what appear to be a group of priests, but they are the suitors in disguise. They offer them wine. The wine's poisoned. Mentor drinks the wine and starts to cough up blood. Telemachus is ambushed. Odysseus dresses a beggar, makes his way into the temple, and saves the day. He kills some of the suitors. Telemachus kills the rest. Telemachus says we need to honor him. Odysseus replies, we'll honor him with fire and come back to give him the proper rites. So Odysseus has rescued Telemachus. Telemachus and Eumaeus take Odysseus back home to the palace. There's a touching scene because Argos, his faithful dog, who is pretty much blind and on death's door. He's a 20-year-old dog. He refuses to die before his master returns. Antonius takes him outside and puts him on an old Hessian bag just outside the palace. Telemachus witnesses this. Odysseus bends down and pats the dog. He knows it's Argos. Argos's tail wags briefly before life leaves his body. I got a little teary in the scene. I was expecting it to be a lot more emotional, but there's not a lot of emotion in this film, unfortunately. But this was the scene that tugged at my heartstrings the most. And you think with an animal, especially a dog, Telemachus slowly figures out who this hermit is. Odysseus starts begging at the feast. He goes around begging for scraps for an old veteran. There's a cool scene where he gets back at Antonius and tells him that he was a veteran that served with Sinon, and hints that he knows who Antonius is and what he did with the lots. Now Odysseus sees Penelope at the loom, and once all the suitors leave, he goes up and talks to her. You'd think Penelope would be able to tell by his voice who he was, but I guess that ruins the mystique. He tells Penelope he's a veteran of the Trojan War and served with her husband, and this is where we get the final flashback to Troy. And the flashbacks get darker and more brutal the more the film progresses. He basically outlines a story where Odysseus and his men basically pay for the sins of the past, and how Odysseus realized what he had done after the city was sacked. It's kind of obvious what was going to happen, but we see the smouldering ruins of Troy in the background, the smoke billowing up to the skies, the piles of dead, and civilians being taken prisoner. Now, Odysseus looks around and he has this bewildered look on his face like, what have I done? And it's at this point he really fully grasps the hubris he has faced over the past 20 years. You get a sense that he realizes what he did was wrong. He's been traumatized by the war, which is the obvious theme of the film. Penelope is listening to his account. It's during this scene that Athena appears one last time to Odysseus, and it's during this flashback that a Trojan girl is being held by the arms. She's on her knees. Odysseus looks at her. One of his men has a sword at her neck before he decapitates her. And this girl is Zendaya. Odysseus could have intervened, but he looks at this statue of Athena, then looks at the girl, looks back, and then she's dead right before the statue is also decapitated. And it becomes very, very clear that Athena is just a hallucination due to PTSD and trauma, which I think is a little subversive because it does change things quite a lot, because Athena is one of the main characters in the book. Now from there, the suitors clear out. Now, there's a scene where Penelope mentions the end of the Bronze Age. I'm not sure if it's here or if it's after this scene, which I thought was really interesting. She mentions, I think to Telemachus or to one of the maids, that we are seeing the end of the Bronze Age, which I don't think someone living during the Bronze Age would have known it was the Bronze Age. It just would have been normal. Like, how do we know what age we're living in? Because we're living it. She mentions that the Bronze Age is ending because people have stopped honouring Zeus, and the sea peoples are roaming and coming closer and closer to Ithaca, which will bring about basically the end of an age and the end of their world. Now, it's during the scene where Odysseus is talking to Penelope that Greek hospitality plays another huge part in the story. The old nurse washes Odysseus' feet, where she notices a scar on his lower shin, just above his foot. He gets injured during a hunting accident, and there's a scene previously in the film where she cleans up his wounds. He flinches when she touches it, and she says, "Do you want a straight scar or a messy one?" As soon as the nurse sees the scar, she knows exactly who this beggar is. He tells her not to say anything, and it's during this scene Antonius sneaks back into the banquet hall, draws a knife, and tries to kill Telemachus while he's talking to Eumaeus. It's during the scene that Penelope announces her plan, and that she will marry one of the suitors if they complete her challenge, which causes Antonius to retreat. She says the following day at dawn or during the evening, she'll announce who she is going to marry. Whoever completes her challenge, she will marry that person, and everyone will leave. Everyone's going to be locked into the palace. All the weapons have been hidden upstairs in a room. The challenge involves stringing Odysseus' bow, the first man that can string this legendary bow and fire an arrow through 12 axes, wins her hand in marriage. Suitors come up and try to string the bow. They all fail until no one is left. Then you hear the beggar say, I will try it. And obviously this is Odysseus. He tries a few times. He doesn't string the bow. On the third time, he strings it. As Penelope's walking off, he fires an arrow through the axe handles into this table. She turns around and realizes that Odysseus, the rightful king of Ithaca, has returned. From here follows the slaughter of the suitors. Odysseus starts picking off suitors left, right, and center with his bow. It's not a lot of blood. I wanted a bit more blood and carnage and violence. There's no real blood or gore. And if we had have got this R rating or the MA rating in Australia, I think this would have been a hell of a lot better, because it is a bit mundane. He's shooting people, they're getting hit with an arrow and they're just going down and dying, which I don't think would have been realistic, but given how the rest of the film has turned out, not everything has been very realistic. Odysseus gets attacked. Two guys hit him with a table. He's getting stomped by a bunch of people. He's stabbing people in the feet with an arrow, which is a pretty cool scene. Melanthius, or however you pronounce his name, he runs upstairs and goes into the storage room to retrieve the weapons. Antonius is hiding behind a pillar saying, "Get weapons, we need to fight back." Before Eumaeus locks him in, Telemachus and Eumaeus kind of just stand there not doing a lot, even though they do participate in the slaughter. Now, there seems to be really never-ending people in this room. It's supposed to be about 100 people, and yeah, it does seem like it's 100 people. He does kill quite a lot of them. But before long, Melanthius, or whatever, however you pronounce his name, cuts through the floor and starts dropping weapons to Antonius and the other suitors. Spears, shields, and swords start dropping from the roof. Now, I would have liked to see Telemachus start killing a few more people. I think he might take out a couple of people, but he goes upstairs to stop Melanthius, however you pronounce his name. And they get into a big fight in the storage room. Telemachus gets his ass kicked before eventually stopping Melanthius. He cuts his throat pretty much. But now the suitors down below have weapons. They're attacking Odysseus pretty brutally. He gets a couple of arrows in him, one in the shoulder and lower back. He gets a couple of spears. Someone tries to run him through with a spear, but he doesn't seem to go down. Odysseus takes his beggar robes off, and he's got armour underneath, which explains why he isn't getting killed by arrows or spears. He does get pretty badly hurt, though. A little bit of blood wouldn't have gone astray because he gets hit with 2 arrows. He's not really in any type of pain. We have to assume that the armour's stopping most of it, but it still would have gone through. A little bit of blood would have been a bit more realistic. He's cutting down suitors left, right, and centre. The good suitors all bow to him and stay where they stay put. The ones that get killed pick up arms or try to stop him. Even though Odysseus is wounded, he's not really stopped. He's got a wound to the throat. There's a cool scene where Penelope shuts the door on Mia Goth's servant girl and says, "You made your choice, now you're going to reap the consequences," and locks her out along with the other servants that sided with the suitors, which is consistent with Homer. Now, a fight between Antonius and Odysseus follows. Unsurprisingly, Odysseus kills Antonius. He pulls the lot out from Sinon and says, "Sinon will see you in Hades," or something, before putting it in his mouth and stabbing him in the throat. Which, once again, is this symmetrical ending that Nolan likes to use so much. The first suitor to get an arrow in the throat is Corey Hawkins' character, which was satisfying when they start all getting cut down. But sometimes during the fight, it got a bit confusing. This scene is also, like the other palace scenes, really fucking dark, and it can be hard to tell what's going on. It's so dark, there's lightning outside, you can see the red paint on the walls, but it's so dark and so dull, it's a little lifeless, even though all this action is taking place. It's a confined area, and it does get a bit confusing because you're kind of struggling to figure out who's who. Everyone's wearing dark clothing. Long gone are the days of the white toga. Everyone's got dark clothing or leather clothing, and it all looks pretty much the same. Now, the point of this is Odysseus is punishing the suitors for their hubris and violating the hospitality of Zeus. So the suitors are slaughtered, order has been restored. The good suitors and servants bow to Odysseus. And there's a scene where Odysseus is on the ground, you think he's dying, and Penelope comes up and comforts him and realizes it's obviously Odysseus. But you kind of know that he's not really dead. From there, Telemachus has been crowned king of Ithaca. The kingdom is left to him. Odysseus and Penelope go on their next journey. Odysseus says he wants to head west to honour the dead, which is exactly what happens. And now we get this symmetrical ending. There's a scene earlier in the film where the sun, I think, is rising in the west. It's pretty much right at the start of the film, not the exact start, but in the first few minutes, where the sun is rising in between 2 mountains. And this is the closing of the film, and that same scene is played in reverse with the sun setting between the 2 mountains. Once again, the symmetrical ending that Nolan loves to play with. So during these closing scenes, the sun is setting, the past and the present have caught up with each other, wrongs have been righted, and some lessons have been learned. And we get this dualistic, symmetrical ending where the sun is setting in between the 2 mountains and the Trojan horse is burning, and that is the last frame of the film right before the credits. And one final criticism I'll have about the film before I get into the more technical side of things: what the fuck was with the song in the credits? It's this weird modern song. It's a Travis Scott rap song, but it's not like a traditional rap song. I only listened to about half of it before I left. It's weird. It's a weird choice for a film set 3,000 years ago. It's got this weird synthesizer sound to it, and it does suit on one hand, but it also seems really out of place on the other. Kind of weird. So what was my initial reaction to the film? I'll give my final verdict a little later on. I'm breaking this down into multiple questions so I can cover every base of this review. So my immediate thoughts on leaving the cinema. Was I entertained? Yes, for a film that's 2 hours and 42 minutes long. It was entertaining. It was big. It was bold. But unfortunately, it was also dull, emotionless, and pretty lifeless. It was entertaining, yes. Did it feel epic? It was billed as an epic, and yes, it is epic in tone and in scope. I don't think it retains the feel or the core of an epic film in the classical sense. Yes, it was an epic film. I just think it was modernized too much for it to be taken seriously as an epic that will stand the test of time. Did it feel emotionally satisfying? No, it didn't. There was a lack of emotion in this film because you start in the Trojan War. I'm meant to care about Odysseus, but you don't really know what he's been through. You get to know Odysseus more as the film goes on and what he's been through, but I think that would have probably helped if the Iliad was made first. Because we're meant to care about a guy and a crew that we don't know a huge amount about at the start. What we know about him is through some of the brief flashbacks, and it's not really until nearly the end of the film when he's talking to Penelope that we get a full sense of the horror of the Trojan War. And I even think that could have been done better. The scenes in Troy at night are good and they are dramatic. I think Nolan could have pushed the envelope and it would have been a bit more impactful. And once again, I think this film needed a higher rating. It needed to be MA and not M. It needed a bit more violence in it, I think, to really convey the message, because there's no blood. It doesn't really feel real. That's the problem. It doesn't feel realistic enough for the audience, well, for me anyway, to take it seriously. Was I surprised by the film? Yeah, I was. I was surprised by the creative choices. I was surprised by how much of the film was actually changed, how much was left out, and how dissimilar it is to the book in a lot of regards. I think it's about maybe 50 or 60% like the book, probably more like 55% like the book. There's a lot of things that would change and modernize, and I was surprised by that. Would I watch it again? Yeah, I would. I think it's a film that I might like better second or third time I see it. I might be able to forgive certain things. I might be able to appreciate things better. But, I don't have 2 hours and 42 minutes to go to the cinema again. And Nolan films are usually pretty dense, and they do take several watchings sometimes to fully understand what he's doing. Was I disappointed? Yeah, I was. I was expecting a bit more authenticity to Homer and not so much of a subversion of Homer. Some of the creative choices, I think, really let this film down, mainly the modern use of dialogue and language and the American accents. Some of the casting choices are also a bit questionable as well. And this brings up the question, should Christopher Nolan have directed this film? Why Nolan? He says he's a fan of Homer. He says he's wanted to make the Odyssey for 20 years. It's a very hard story to try to translate to a film. I actually think he would have been better off doing a 2-part film rather than trying to squeeze everything into one just under 3-hour film. I think the first film should have been dedicated to the Trojan War and the start of the journey. And I think the second part of the film should have been setting sail, going on the journey after the Trojan War. I think one film really needed to be dedicated to the Trojan War and what happened there, so we could fully appreciate Odysseus and what he's been through, and it would have helped the audience care a bit more about him and his men, because, like I said, there's not a lot of emotion in this film, and that's a huge criticism of Christopher Nolan's films, is he's been accused of not really being emotional enough, and I don't think he is. I don't think he actually gets human emotion all that well. I think he gets scope and he gets scale and spectacle. I think he really does struggle when it comes to emotion, because his films are very emotionless. They're very analytical and very scientific. They do lack emotion and that human quality. So was Nolan the right directing choice? Yes and no. I think other directors probably could have told this story better. I think James Cameron would have done a better job at this, because he understands human emotion. He understands epics because he's made enough of them. He can utilize technology. But I think the core of Cameron's filmmaking is human emotion, and that's been a trait of all of his films, whether it's sci-fi or history or contemporary. He's always understood what makes a good story is the fundamental human emotion. You look at Titanic, you look how epic in scope and scale that film is. Yes, it's about the disaster, obviously, but it's also, at its core, a story about a young guy, a young girl falling in love, star-crossed lovers on this doomed ship. And that's what makes the film so engaging. You couldn't really engage with the ship if there wasn't the characters on the ship to engage with. We can all relate to Jack and Rose, or the other characters. It's kind of hard to engage with a piece of metal. Ridley Scott 20 years ago after Gladiator might have been able to pull this off. I think Nolan was right in some regards. He does like non-linear storytelling and playing with time, but I think he just changed too much stuff. I think he used one translation. I think he really needed to use more than one translation of the Odyssey. And I think the biggest flaw, he went full DEI on it, and essentially I think he hamstrung his own vision. It's like he's trying too hard to try to appease everyone. And I think the rumors about him casting a bunch of diverse actors just to get an Academy Award is probably pretty true. I think he's got a taste for Oscars now, and he'll do whatever he can to get another one. Because during his acceptance speech for Oppenheimer, he said something that did concern me. He said, or I think it was his wife that said it, not so much him. She said, "This has been a dream of ours for all these years, and this is why we make movies," implying that they make movies to win awards, not about the audience. And this is a guy that has typically been at odds with the Academy over the years, going right back to The Dark Knight. This is a guy that didn't really play by the Academy rules, or he didn't go on the campaign trails, and now all of a sudden he seems to have bent the knee to Hollywood. He's going to cast a diverse epic to show that, oh, look how diverse I am, because he's got all the bases covered. You've got a fat member of Odysseus' crew, you have a trans person, you have a woman of colour, there's an Indian actor who plays Odysseus' right-hand man, you have a Korean actor on the crew, as well as a couple of African actors. That doesn't make a lot of sense if you're trying to tell a story set in ancient Greece. Why would there just be a random Korean member of Odysseus' crew 3,500 years ago? It's diversity for diversity's sake. I don't think it helps tell the story. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism for Nolan's vision is going to come from. Because, yeah, I can get on board with diversity if it helps tell the story and it's in context of the story. When it's like this, it seems like he's subverting a classic for a modern DEI narrative. He's subverting Homer to appease woke Hollywood, to show he's progressive so he can get that next gold statue. It doesn't help push the story further. And I don't think this film will last the test of time like his other films have. Because he made it too modern, he made it too progressive. I just don't think that lasts in the long run. Because he has enough clout and enough weight, just his name alone and his track record for success, he could have really stood up to the studios and said, no, I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to make it as authentic as possible. And they probably would have let him do it. It obviously seems that there's an ulterior motive here. Whether he's doing this just so he can get another Oscar, is he fucking compromised? Does he actually believe in this woke shit? Because there was a picture of him with his wife at an anti-Donald Trump rally last year or the year before. So I really do have my questions about Nolan. Is he simply just high on his own supply? Is he just arrogant? Has he become so pretentious that even he believes that, oh, Christopher Nolan's making a Christopher Nolan film and that he can't do any wrong? Because it's not just an epic, it's a Nolan epic. Does his directing style work for this film? Yes, I think it does. I think he has the vision. I think he has the scope using the IMAX, even though I don't particularly agree with it. Nolan has proven he can handle big films and big subject matter. So I think his directing style does work for the film. However, I don't think his style really fits Greek mythology or the ancient period. I just don't think he gets it. I don't think he truly understands mythology. Because at what point does an adaptation stop being Homer's Odyssey and starts to become Nolan's Odyssey? I think the PTSD angle is a very good example of this. In Homer, Odysseus always has clearly experienced profound trauma. He's lost a lot of companions over the years. He spent years away from home. He weeps openly when hearing songs about Troy, and he carries the emotional weight of war. But the poem doesn't define him primarily through trauma. He remains a very resourceful individual. Polymetis, I think it's how it's pronounced, or meaning of many councils. He's deeply religious. He always respects the gods. He's conscious of fate. He's respectful of sacrifice and ritual. He's constantly aware that the gods are very real forces in his world, and there's real world consequences for defying the gods. There's many passages in the book where he makes sacrifices to the gods. He'll sacrifice an animal or something, and he'll give the proper rites to the gods before feeding himself or his crew. The gods always come first. And I think Nolan is being deliberately subversive, because there's several lines in the film where Odysseus says, "I defy the gods," or "I'm defying the gods," or something like that. The literal tagline on the poster is "Defy the gods," and I think that completely misses the whole point, because Odysseus never would defy the gods willingly. And it seems like Nolan's Odysseus defies the gods multiple times. If Nolan foregrounds PTSD as the central lens through which we understand Odysseus, that's a legitimate artistic choice from Nolan, but it changes the emphasis of the character. "I defy the gods" is potentially even more significant. In Homer, Odysseus certainly argues with the gods. He laments his fate, and he acts recklessly sometimes, but outright defiance is not his defining attitude. The poem's worldview is one in which humans operate within limits set by fate and by the gods. Athena is his greatest ally, and even when Poseidon opposes him, Odysseus doesn't build his identity around rebellion against the divine order. And one of Homer's central tensions is this idea of human ingenuity versus divine power. Odysseus succeeds because of both his intelligence and divine assistance. He couldn't get too far without Athena's assistance. Neither could Telemachus, and Athena is a massive part of the book, and she's not really that impactful in Nolan's film. She is the guide, the weaver of destiny that brings Odysseus home, because he could not do it by himself. The poem repeatedly presents him as a man whose cleverness works within a cosmos governed by gods and fate. And the film shifts that. Christopher Nolan hasn't simply adapted Homer's Odyssey. He's reinterpreting the whole worldview. Homer's Odysseus is a man navigating a universe where the gods are an unavoidable reality. Nolan's Odysseus appears closer to a modern protagonist, psychologically scarred, defined by his trauma, and willing to stand against the divine itself, as evident in the line in Circe's hut where he says, "I defy the gods." Homer's Odysseus would never say that. So whether that makes for a better film is open to debate and depends on if you like the film or not. But it does create a fundamentally different hero. And I'm not convinced that he does fully understand mythology. I think that is probably his biggest Achilles heel. I think it becomes apparent that Christopher Nolan wasn't interested in faithfully translating Homer's mythic worldview. He was instead creating a Christopher Nolan film inspired by Homer's Odyssey. And that is my biggest issue, is that in this process, I think he has lost the soul of the poem. The mythic worldview is diminished by opening the film with this quote, "a time of apparent magic." I think the film seems to cast doubt on the supernatural rather than embracing it as Homer does. And this is obvious with other aspects of the film too. The gods are mentioned, but they're never really there. Athena's role is really reduced. In the poem, she's almost a co-protagonist, shaping events, going undercover in disguise, helping the heroes, shaping events from the opening of the book onwards. If her influence is minimalized, the balance between human agency and divine intervention changes dramatically. Odysseus becomes a fundamentally different character. A stronger focus on the psychological trauma and defiance of the gods shifts him away from Homer's hero, whose intelligence operates with a divinely ordered cosmos. The journey becomes more about spectacle. Encounters like the giants can feel like just another action set piece rather than episodes that reveal something much more about civilization, hospitality, or human nature. which changes the tone of the film. Homer mixes danger, wonder, irony, tenderness, hospitality, humour, and horror. If the adaptation leans heavily into darkness or war, it can lose the tonal richness of what Homer is trying to tell us. And that filters into the language as well. The language feels detached from the performances. Even if Homeric dialogue is used, it needs performances that make elevated language feel natural rather than recited. I think the film simplifies a rich mythological tradition into something more familiar to a modern blockbuster audience. In doing so, I think it also becomes easier to consume, but less rewarding to contemplate. And for me, this isn't a failure of filmmaking so much as a failure of translation. Nolan translates the Odyssey into a modern psychological epic, but in doing so, he leaves behind the mythic imagination that gave Homer's poem its enduring power. And what happens when you remove the mythic worldview from one of the foundational myths of Western civilization? That's a very long way of just explaining, does his style fit Greek mythology? And I think the answer to that is no. Now, the Odyssey, much like his other films, there are these overlapping traits, symmetrical architecture in the form of the palace. There's two staircases on either side of the banquet hall. The banquet hall is got a channel running down it. The tables are all lined up. There's also like fire in the middle of the tables, which looked a little too modern. They look like those barbecue tables that Guy Ritchie makes. There's the steps. Penelope's chamber has these steps that lead down to the palace dining area. It's all very symmetrical, which fits in with the symmetrical nature of Nolan's production design as well as his story and storytelling. For all the criticisms of Nolan, what he did exceptionally well was bring the scale of this story to the big screen. It is beautifully shot. The cinematography is great. There's some really great looking scenes. For as much as I think IMAX is a gimmick, Nolan really knows how to use it well. He doesn't try to do anything too fancy with it. I think he lets the frame speak for itself with the scope and the scale of it. It was a well-directed film too. My criticisms aren't with the technical side of the film. Well, I do have some technical criticisms because I think the film was way too dark. I think it really needed more colour. It's a bit dull. And it's too dark. All these ancient films are always dark and broody and depressive looking. Not everything has to look like Batman. It can look like ancient Greece. You don't have to make it dull and this, cinematic look to it. You can make it a bit more colourful. But overall, it is a really well-directed film. It's a good story told by a master director. I think where he struggles is the writing. I don't think Nolan is as good of a writer as he is a director. I think directing is his thing. I think when he has a writing partner, his scripts are a lot better because the dialogue in this film fucking sucks. And it's so weird too because he uses this balance of very modern language, but then he has characters saying lines of poetry from the book or lines that sound like poetry from the book. When Odysseus and Penelope are sailing off to the west, Odysseus recites this very poetic verse, but it's done in this American accent and it completely takes you out of it because he should be saying this poetically like a fucking poet. And it's an example of where Nolan could have really made this film really special by using even more poetic language to it. But he doesn't because there's other lines like, "You're a sniveling little bastard pining for a daddy," or "My dad's coming home." So you have this complete opposite mix of bullshit modern language versus very poetic, Homeric sounding language. And I think he really struggles with the writing more than anything else in this. I don't think he really knew how to handle both. It's like he wants to make the film modern but also tip the cap to Homer and poetry every once in a while. And for all the big changes he made, I think this might have been the most critical mistake he could have made. And I can't help but think if a director like Robert Eggers, who is so obsessed with history and detail and language, if he had made this what the Odyssey would have been, he probably would have had it all in ancient Greek or Latin. I can't help to think how authentic he would have been to it and how much better the story would have been because of it. Because I don't think this film can be called an epic that's going to last the test of time. I just don't see it happening. It's just too inauthentic. So let's look at the other aspects of the film, such as story and pacing, costume and music. and have a look what was done well and what wasn't. So story and pacing. Does it hook the audience? Does it drag on? Was it satisfying for a 3-hour film? Now, overall, the pacing of the film is pretty good. There are parts in the film that do drag on a little too long, and there's other parts that are just fucking boring. The biggest pacing issue is the choppy way the intro is edited. It cuts back and forth, like as I mentioned, between past and present. I don't think it's necessarily like a huge deal because there is a lot of story and a lot of background you have to cover with a story such as this. I think more breathing time in the start would have been better. I think he should have just started it with the Trojan War or started it with the bard reciting the story and gone straight into the Telemachus story, and the suitors then transitioned back into the Trojan War. But ultimately, I think it works either way. It is, as I just mentioned, it is a well-paced film, but it's also a weirdly paced film because the film tends to slow down before the journey home begins and when they're heading to the first island and the Cyclops cave. It slows down around that point, and then it picks up with the consecutive misadventures right after each other. From the fight with the giants, slows down a bit more with Circe, slows down a little bit when it comes to the underworld, picks up with the Sirens and Sula, and then slows right down with Hyperion's Island and Calypso's Island, and then in the third act it starts to pick up again, which ultimately builds to the climax of the film. Now, it didn't feel like it was overly long. I've seen 3-hour films that have dragged on far longer than this. I think overall the pacing was pretty good. The editing, despite the weird choppy style that Nolan does work. I honestly think he probably could have shaved some time off in other places too. I think some things probably could have been cut out or cut down a bit more because it is such a massive story to try to squeeze into 2 hours and 52 minutes. And I think splitting the film up into 2 parts probably would have been a lot better. It could have allowed the story to breathe a bit more. So let's move on to acting. We're going to go character by character to see if they worked or they didn't. So first up is Odysseus. The role of Odysseus is a bit of a controversial one too. Yeah, Matt Damon does a good job, but overall I think it's Matt Damon playing Matt Damon. There's other actors I think would have been a far better Odysseus. I think Christian Bale probably would have been top of my list. Russell Crowe in his prime would have fucking nailed this perfectly. Russell Crowe 20 years ago would have been a fucking perfect Odysseus. It's not an easy role to play by any means, but I think Matt Damon was kind of just Matt Damon. If he had done the accent, I think it would have helped me buy the illusion of Odysseus more. And I do like Matt Damon. He's a great actor. I just think he's one of those actors that is kind of always Matt Damon. Yeah, he can play different characters. Like I think he did a fantastic job in The Last Duel. He's got the mullet and that weird beard. Like some actors are always their personas, or they always appear to be their personas. Like Tom Cruise is always Tom Cruise. When Tom Cruise plays a samurai, it's still Tom Cruise playing a samurai. But when Russell Crowe plays a Roman general and a gladiator or a commander of a ship in the 1700s, he's tapping into that character on a 3-dimensional level. He's not just Russell Crowe playing a Roman general, he becomes the Roman general. And I think Matt Damon is playing Odysseus rather than really convincing me that he is Odysseus. I think some actors can do this, others can't. I think some actors are always their personalities, they're always that movie star, and they have a hard time breaking the persona from the character. Now, one movie star that can break that persona is Brad Pitt. He can definitely play characters. I think he's actually a very underrated character actor. But Matt Damon as Odysseus, he is likable. He can be charismatic. He is intelligent. He does do a good job of getting the witty side across, but I think that could have been done a little better because he's so hamstrung by the blame game. He's always blamed for everything. So whenever he is acting intelligent, whenever he does do something smart or cunning, there's always this like negative consequence to it, which it's nearly like to the point like he can't be smart because he's going to get fucking punished for it. And yeah, Homer goes into that, the hubris, being punished for his hubris against the gods and some of the decision making. But Homer treats it like, as I mentioned before, it's intelligence without humility that gets him into trouble. You can still be intelligent with the humility. And in this, I think it's intelligence with blame. Because Nolan's telling us he's got PTSD and it's he's seen too much war, but whenever he does something smart, he's blamed and punished. The lesson isn't being inferred in that. And I think in a way that kind of hamstrings the character, because it's almost like he can't, or he's hesitant to be smart because he's going to get blamed by his crew eventually for something. Where Homer looks at the blame game as 50-50, it's half the crew's fault for their stupid decision-making that gets him into trouble and gets him killed, and it's half Odysseus. Where Nolan treats it more so it's just Odysseus' fault that everyone gets killed. Matt Damon does a very good job of portraying a complex character. I don't think he's quite as charismatic as Odysseus is in the books. Damon does try. I think the strongest part of his Odysseus is he does portray him as complex, and there's multiple things going on with him. I think some of the best scenes are with him and Calypso on the island, where he's forgetting and he's starting to remember and put the story back together, and he's starting to realize the weight of what has happened. But at the same time, that weight would have been far more dramatic if he met his mother in the underworld, who tells him, your kingdom's under threat, your wife is being pressured by these suitors, and you need to come back and restore order. He's a very different character from Homer's Odysseus, and I don't think that was the smartest direction Nolan really could have gone down. I mean, Matt Damon can only play him as well as he's written. I don't think Nolan really writes him that well, or is really faithful to Homer. Now, Penelope, on the other hand, she is faithful, strong, and intelligent in the book, and I think this is the one character where Nolan does get right. She is faithful. She does have her doubts and her moments where she doesn't think he's going to come back, but ultimately she is faithful to Odysseus, and I really did like Anne Hathaway's portrayal as Penelope. I think she's one of the standouts in the film for the limited time she actually has. She fends the suitors off. She keeps them at bay as best as she can. She's very intelligent. She knows there's this bigger thing happening in the world. She has to defend her patch of ground, but she knows, as she says in the film, she knows the Bronze Age is ending, the gods have been defied, and the Greeks are being punished for it, and these sea people are causing havoc. So she knows a lot. She's tapped into what's happening on the inside and on the outside. She knows her son has to go and find his own way. He has to become a man, but at the same time, he's at threat from being killed by the suitors. She knows her servants some are loyal, some are not, some are spying on her. She believes Odysseus is coming back. And I think this Penelope is one character that Nolan does get right. She's essential to the story. I just actually wish there was more screen time with Penelope and more scenes with her and Odysseus, but I guess that makes their reunion at the end more valuable. But at the same time, there's not a lot of emotional weight there. These are characters that haven't seen each other in 20 years, that the whole time that Odysseus is away, all he can think about is getting back to his wife. She knows he's coming home, and that reunion is just emotionless. And I think if someone like Cameron had directed this film, someone who understands human emotion better than Nolan, I think this would have been a far more satisfying payoff. And the same goes for Athena, because Athena does not feel like a goddess. She doesn't really do much that is wise in this movie. She kind of blames Odysseus and gives him a couple of useful tidbits of information, but that's about it. She's not manipulative, or in a good way. She doesn't really steer the characters like she does in the book. She's not overly protective of the characters either, because she is quite protective of Telemachus in the book and Odysseus. She wants these characters to succeed and come back to their home and put things right. She does forgive Odysseus, even though he has caused offense to the gods. She can see the true Odysseus deep down, that he's smart and can be wise. He just has this ego problem. And I think Nolan just completely fucks the character of Athena up. Turning her into a PTSD hallucination just completely disrespects this character. It reduces her to a figment of Odysseus' imagination rather than a central protagonist of the film, this guide who is guiding all these events. Because that's what she's in the book. She's basically the guide. She is steering Odysseus and Telemachus in the right direction, especially Odysseus when he is, he's lost at sea, he's got no idea how to get back. I think Nolan does lose that character majorly. In the book, you get more of a sense of hopelessness and dread through Odysseus. He really wants to get back home. He knows there's this time limit. There's this anxiety around the character, and that doesn't translate with Nolan because he cuts that scene out from the underworld, and it completely changes the whole fucking second half narrative of the film. There isn't that anxiety there because there's parts in the book you're just like, oh, fucking hell, this poor guy just wants to get home. And like, there's a scene with the Phoenician king where the bard is recounting the story of the Trojan War, and he fucking starts crying. And the king tells the bard to stop and everyone to leave because you can see that this is having a massive emotional effect on Odysseus. And I just don't get that emotion there. There is this emotion because he's always crying. The crew cry when a shipmate gets killed. They make libations to the gods. They eat and drink in his honor, and they all stand around crying together. There's just not that emotion in the film, and that was fucking one of the most frustrating parts of it because it should be emotional. He spends 20 years trying to get back to his fucking wife and his child that he doesn't know, and there is not a lot of emotion there. Now, Poseidon isn't really mentioned in apart from the Cyclops. Poseidon is only mentioned once or twice, unlike the book. Now, Telemachus. Telemachus was one of the most surprising characters to me. I don't really rate Tom Holland that much. I mean, he's a good actor. I think with Tom Holland, he gets associated with Spider-Man too much, and he gets lumped into these one-dimensional actors that are really stereotyped to the one kind of character. But Tom Holland actually really surprised me. I wasn't expecting much from him, and I think he's one of the standouts in the film. Anne Hathaway, by far, is the best performance in the film, and I think Tom Holland is a very close second. He really impressed me. All the bad dialogue aside, I think he does really capture the spirit of Telemachus and what he is going through. Because Telemachus is hopeful. He knows his dad's alive, and I really think Tom Holland does get that right. He really does nail the character of Telemachus. Even though he doesn't get manhandled quite so easily in the book, I think that is more done for dramatic effect. I did really like what Holland does with Telemachus and that overall story. And he does have this very definitive character development. He leaves a boy, comes back a man. I just wish the relationship with Odysseus was a bit more emotional when he finds out that the beggar in front of him is actually his father. You wanted a bit more from that. I wanted a bit more drama, maybe, and a passionate embrace with this long lost father figure. Because Anne Hathaway and Tom Holland really do turn on the emotion, and without their performances, this film isn't very emotional. And unfortunately, I don't think Matt Damon quite translate that emotion. He does try, and he does give an emotional performance, but it's ultimately hamstrung by the changing of his character, where Telemachus and Penelope largely stay the same in the film as they do in the book. Other standout performances are Robert Pattinson. He is such a good bad guy. He's an absolute fucking prick, but he just fucking nails it. And he's going to be one of the most diverse actors working in Hollywood. That guy can do anything. I don't think two of his characters have ever been the same. He is a perfect example of an actor that will never be stereotyped to one role, because after Twilight, I thought that dude's career was over. He was going to be playing the heartthrob in every fucking teenage vampire movie until he was fucking 65. I thought his career was done. I fucking hated the Twilight movies. I only saw the one of them and I didn't get it. I thought, wow, he's this lifeless pretty boy. And then the next film I saw, I mean, I didn't want to see a Rob Pattinson film. The Twilight films put me off of him for a very long time until he did that movie, The Rover, in, what was that, 2011, 2012? Whenever that was actually shot in my home state. And he plays this fucking, like, inbred outback, like, hillbilly. And he was fucking amazing. He had, like, the mangled teeth, and I thought, fuck, this dude's a really good actor. And then the other films he's done over the years, he was great as Batman. I can't wait to see him as Scar Taylor in June Part 3. He was really good. Maybe the most surprising character was Eumaeus, played by John Leguizamo, however you pronounce his last name. He was great as Eumaeus. He's playing a much older character than he is in real life. I thought he was great. He does a lot with the screen time given to him. Some of the secondary performances in this are really good too. There's a couple of members of Odysseus' crew that have some really good performances. Samantha Morton too was good. She didn't blow me away because she was kind of like Samantha Morton from The Walking Dead and other weird characters that she's played. She always plays weird characters. Alpha in Walking Dead. She's a fucking brutal character in that. Yeah, she was good. But John Leguizamo, however you pronounce his name, he was really, really good. He's figured out all the suitors out. He knows who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. Even though he's blind in one eye, you're not going to get one over on him. And I think that is the other huge problem with this film, is the cast is just too fucking big. There's too many stars in very small roles. I think if he had have given some parts to some unknowns, do what James Cameron does, cast unknowns and then turn them into stars, because James Cameron has usually picked no-name actors in his films. Sam Worthington was pretty much nobody before Avatar. He picked him because of his attitude, not because of his stardom, because Matt Damon was in the running for Jake Sully before he was beaten by, I think he turned it down, and Sam Worthington got the role of Jake Sully, and I couldn't picture that role without Sam Worthington in it. Arnold Schwarzenegger was a nobody before Terminator. He picked a Austrian bodybuilder that couldn't really speak English all that well and turned him into a household name. DiCaprio too, he had only done a handful of films before Titanic. Kate Winslet. Cameron's got a way of picking talent, even if it hasn't been found yet. And I think a huge reliance of this film was the cast, because some members of the cast get a couple of minutes, which makes the controversial casting choices even weirder, that you would risk the reputation of your film for actors who are only in it for sometimes maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Some of the controversial casting choices only have maybe a minute, and ultimately they don't make up a huge part of the film or really have that much impact because they don't really have enough time to. The other casting choice I haven't really mentioned yet is Charlize Theron. I am a huge fan of Charlize Theron, but I think she's miscast as Calypso, because Calypso is supposed to be this goddess that, you know, pampers and really does love Odysseus. She's described as a god with like this kind of mesh cloak thing on and braided hair. I think someone like Sydney Sweeney or Margot Robbie would have been a really great choice for that. It needs to be someone that you want to spend 7 years on an island with. And I don't think most people would last more than 2 weeks with Charlize Theron, because she's apparently supposed to be quite intense. Yes, she's a beautiful woman, but she has a very feminine, masculine kind of look about her. She's not like the traditional fragile looking woman. She looks like she could kick the shit out of most men. She does a great job of Calypso. I just think maybe a softer, more feminine looking actress. I think she's got more of a reputation as being the action chick. She's great in Mad Max Fury Road and films like that. She has that rough and tough look about her. Supporting cast too was good. Ryan Hurst does a good job with the time he has. Cinematography is up and down. Ultimately, it is good. The scenes where the color palette of the Mediterranean come through are really good. But ultimately, I think the film is way too dark. It's too dark and brooding. Everything looks dark and dismal, where it should look brighter and more like the Mediterranean. It should have a bit more color. And I'm just sick of that. Everything being so dark. So many movies now, they're so darkly lit, you can't see what's going on. And TV shows do this too. Everything's fucking dark and moody. Let some fucking brightness in. You can still tell a dramatic story if you have a bright exterior in a beautiful location. Dune has done this better than most films. You look how dark that subject matter is. Yes, that film does have its darker moments cinematography-wise, but you look at the scenes in the desert where it's bright, everything is pretty much the same color, yet the cinematography is absolutely stunning and it's won an Academy Award. The scenes during the morning after the city has been attacked, you see the columns of black smoke in this blue sky. You can tell dark stories with brighter landscapes and cinematography. I just wish it would have looked more like ancient Greece and less like the south of Wales or Scotland in the middle of winter. Because that's a lot of the film does look like that, especially when they're going to island. They look like islands in Scotland or Wales and not like the Mediterranean. I did like the use of practical effects. It was nice seeing real ships on screen, even if the ships were not at all Greek. They looked like Viking ships. I did like that. The use of practical over CGI. There was a little bit of CGI here and there, but the palace looks like a real palace, even though some of it would have been most likely CGI. I did like the use of practical effects and real environments and ships and things like that. The Trojan horse looked like it was made out of wood, even though it looked like it was carved. The sailing scenes look really good, and ultimately I don't think it really does look like the Mediterranean or resemble the Bronze Age at all. The scenes involving ships on the sea actually look like a real ship on the ocean. And I think that helped give it the scale and the scope that this was a massive fucking ocean to cross, and it did imply that this would be a dangerous voyage. You get the scale of how small the boats and the people are in this massive blue ocean. Music, on the other hand, was a bit up and down. I did like the use of traditional instruments, the gongs and the harps and things like that. But I really don't get the use of the synthesizer, because Ludwig Göransson has said, Christopher Nolan said he would like him to use traditional instruments that were akin to the time period. There was no orchestras 3,000 years ago, so don't use an orchestra or something like that. So he used gongs and more traditional instruments, and he brought like 35 brass gongs. And he said, I didn't use anything that wasn't of the time period. Oh, but we also used synthesizers, which makes no fucking sense, which is kind of the theme of this film. It tries so hard to be epic and grand and this return to big epic cinema, but hamstrings itself with modern bullshit. And the music kind of follows this. The traditional music in this is really striking, and you hear it and you think, wow, this is what gongs and brass instruments and the harp sounded like all these years ago. Then you get this like irritating, sounds like a mosquito kind of in the back of the theater. Then you realize, oh yeah, that's a synthesizer. Why the fuck is that there? What point does the synthesizer have in a score that is supposed to sound like it was from 3,000 years ago? Now that does work in one scene with the siren song, because you don't hear the siren song. There is a theme to the sirens. It has this scratchy, artificial kind of sound, which I think the synthesizer does work in that scene. And obviously that does work with Odysseus, because the sirens are letting him hear what he wants to hear, which is Penelope. And I think that is important for Penelope's theme. It makes it distinctive, and that's personal to him. During the siren scenes, that does work, but I really think he really could have fucked the synthesizer off and just used traditional sounding instruments. But that also doesn't really fit with Nolan's logic, because Nolan is so pedantic about using traditional instruments, but you haven't used any traditional fucking aspects of the production design. Everything is like mismatched from different parts of history, which I'll get to in a moment. And I don't think this focus on modern language and elements elevates the film. I don't think it helps it feels timeless. And I don't think this film will be a timeless film because of that. I think it will age poorly. In 10 to 20 years' time, I don't think the modern, diverse, creative choices of this film are going to help it. I think sticking true to the source material would have been the way to go. And I think he's been blinded by that gold shiny statue. He definitely wants another Oscar. And I think he's making films to win awards and not for the audience experience. Because it doesn't have much of an emotional impact too, really does prevent this film from being a timeless feeling film. Because there's not a lot of emotion. He's Nolan, for all the things he is good at, he is really bad at fucking emotion. He doesn't get human emotion all that well, I don't think. But this brings up the other huge part of this film, production design. You can't have a film this epic without a great production design or team behind it. So now we come down to the most nitpicky part of the production, and that is the armour. and the weapons and the world of ancient Greece. And for me, this is one of the biggest aspects of the film. I think I can overlook certain things, but when it comes to the historical accuracy of the time period, I don't think I can forgive Nolan. I can overlook some creative decisions like music and a few things like that. Taking a few creative liberties, but the armor and the clothing, the time period, these are the things that really do piss me off, and these are the things that I will be focusing a lot on, because if you don't have the aesthetics, you don't really have the time period. And when you have inconsistencies in the dialogue, when you favor this modern woke bullshit over classicalism, when you have the dialogue, when you have a lack of emotion, you cut parts of the story out, you change things, and then you don't have authentic armor and weapons and things like that. It's just, you're stacking so many things against you, and it was really frustrating because I really wanted to like this film more than I did. And unfortunately, there's just too many fucking negative points about it. There's too many things he fucking changed. And one of the biggest ones is the armor. Like, Hollywood just has this obsession with crested helmets. Everything has to look brown and drab and bronze. And he said he made this creative choice of having black and bronze, which apparently was a stylistic, an aesthetic thing 3,000 years ago. Not like anyone would know. Because I've seen armor from all different time periods, real armor in the Louvre in Paris. I've seen samurai armor, and it is fucking incredible when you see it. It's so bright and colorful. I saw this one set of armor that was purple, white, and gold. It was incredible. It had like this shredder-style helmet. It was ornate, elaborate. There was one set of armor I wanted to take home. It was blue, gold, and silver. It was fucking incredible. It was the nicest set of samurai armor. I know that's samurai, but when you look back at the knight's armor, King Louis's armor had all this ornate engraving on it. It was incredible. There were works of art. I've seen a real Spartan helmet. It was corroded and all oxidized, so it was kind of hard to tell what it would have looked like. Roman armor looked really cool. I've seen some examples of Greek armor. It did look nice. It wasn't as elaborate as some later periods, but it definitely was more decorative than Nolan's Odyssey. And if you know anything about armor from 3,000 years ago, Dendra armor was what they used to wear 3,500 years ago, which is far different from Troy or the Odyssey. Dendra armor was like circular kind of tubes. It was kind of primitive. Apparently it wasn't as heavy as it looked, and it was actually more comfortable. But it was designed to protect the wearer from the brutal reality of Bronze Age warfare. It had like a series of tubes, kind of like tubes stacked on top of each other that went up to the chin. Odysseus is famous for having this boar tusk helmet, not a Corinthian-style helmet. And they have found boar tusk helmets in burial sites in the Mediterranean. And Homer does specifically mention a boar tusk helmet. Bronze Age equipment, the swords didn't really look like bronze swords. I think Troy does a better job of being faithful to the time period, even though it's not 100% correct. Nothing ever is. But the armor in Troy, I think, looks more authentic. It looks like thick woven material. A lot of the Greeks looked a lot more tribal, and I think that is a bit more authentic to the time period. They had like somehow like hide shields and leather armor. None of the Greeks looked uniform. They all looked different. And I think Troy does a better job of being more faithful to the time period, even though it's not quite accurate. I think it does a better job, and it definitely looks like it's from the Bronze Age, where the Odyssey looks like a mismatch of different styles throughout history, and I think even some fictional armor. I will be deducting a star due to pretty much everyone wearing pants. Pants weren't invented in ancient Greece. The Greeks didn't wear them. They thought they were barbaric. They were invented a lot later. And Odysseus and his crew all seem to wear brown pants and brown leather boots, and everything seems to be dark brown. Yes, while I do like that color, I just don't think it's accurate to the time period. I think it looks more like fantasy armor. I didn't really think the armor design was that good. It looks like, obviously, bronze. It has this kind of like a very angular look to it, tracing the muscles of the pecs. It looks very straight. Looks kind of boring too. Agamemnon's armour is fucking ridiculous. You don't really get a good look at the other Greeks. Menelaus has a cool looking helmet, but it looks more like a fantasy video game set in the late Bronze Age. There was a Troy video game I played years ago. The armor looks more like that, or some of the armor sets you get in Assassin's Creed. Swords, yeah, looked like a mashup of Bronze Age swords and swords from a later time period. The swords and the weapons were all over the place. The Trojans look ridiculous. The bows looked a bit more authentic. You don't see a lot of spears in the film. The spears are just kind of generic. But now we get down to the real big elephant in the room in terms of production, and that is the ship. The ships in this are not Greek ships. They look more like Viking ships, like that low hull keel design that Viking ships have. And if you know anything about Viking ships, they could sail in pretty shallow water because they didn't really have a low keel on them. They kind of like floated over the waves, and that was the genius of those ships and why they could move so fast. And they also could carry them. They weren't that heavy. They could turn them around, and that's why they could literally pick them up, put them in a river, and then sail down a river and penetrate so deeply into places like England. And Odysseus' ships look more like Viking ships than Greek ships, which is when they get stuck on Hyperion's island when there's no wind. It looks like the crew could have probably dislodged the ship and turned it around and not had to wait 30 days for the wind to change. Now, when you think of that in the context of the book, with a real ancient Greek ship, like a trireme or something like that, they were much bigger, heavier ships that sat deeper in the water. They also had a big brass ram on them and were pretty much impossible to turn around. Once they beached themselves, you really had to wait for the wind to try to push them back out, or get a lot of crew to push them back into the ocean, which obviously at this stage in the story Odysseus doesn't have. Yeah, I just don't get why Nolan didn't do this. He waffled on about being authentic to Homer and to the time period and all this other shit, but takes so many creative liberties. The oars do look like they're from the time period. There isn't really a huge focus on navigation in this. I think the ships are probably too small too. And as I said, there was 12 ships, not 3. Homer also refers repeatedly to the ships as being black ships and having white sails. And Odysseus' ship does have a red sail. That I might be remembering that wrong, but I'm pretty sure they're described as white sails and black ships. Architecture-wise, it does look like the Bronze Age. I did like the design of Troy. That did look like... It looked very similar from Troy, from the film Troy, and how you would think the Trojan city would look. That did look cool. I did like that for what you do see of it, and most of it is at night, so it is a bit hard to tell. Odysseus' palace was cool. I did like the design of that, the red walls, because apparently that's a ruin somewhere. They did have remnants of this red terracotta-style paint on the wall, which is believed to be Odysseus' palace, so that was a realistic, historically accurate thing to incorporate. Now, the rest of the architecture, there isn't a huge focus on other areas. You do see Sparta briefly, some of the palaces, but you just see like a generic-looking palace, so it can be a bit hard to tell. But Odysseus' palace does look authentic. It just would have been nicer if it was a bit more brighter, and you'd especially the Penelope's quarters, they look a bit Spartan. Because she's such a regal-looking woman, she's always wearing reds and blues and things like that. And the balcony scene where you see her Odysseus' room and her room, and it looks out over the ocean and you can see the clouds. That's really cool. I did like the design of that. It had that Greek-style looking stone. Unfortunately, the bed wasn't really highlighted. That does play a part in the book. The bed made out of olive wood or something like that. And once again, this style kind of carries over to the costumes. Some costumes look authentic and others just look fucking ridiculous. Like what the suitors wear does look alright. Like what Antonius wears kind of looks more like the Emperor from Gladiator than the late Bronze Age. Penelope has a very distinctive look. She always has her hair back and she's always wearing gold jewelry, as you'd expect. But I just really wish you saw more of Penelope and more of Anne Hathaway. Telemachus's costumes were really stupid. They started off being really over the top. I did like that embossed leather cuirass thing he wears. towards the end of the film. Towards the end of the film, the costumes looked a bit more realistic with Telemachus. He was wearing a skirt with like high-greaved boots, the long sleeves with the cuirass over the top, which is, I think, a bit more time period correct. The scene where they're shooting the fucking quails, it looked like Robin Hood. It looked like medieval day costumes, which look ridiculous. The pants too, like if there were some scenes they're wearing pants, other scenes they're wearing skirts. Robert Pattinson's Antonius was wearing a leather skirt, which looked more historically accurate. And there's other scenes where him and Corey Hawkins are standing there, and Corey Hawkins looks like he's wearing a fucking pirate outfit. He's wearing like a leather vest with pants. The clothing was just all over the place. I think there's too much creative liberty from Nolan. There's too much freedom to try to pick and choose, and it really does take you out of the time period. And I think that was really unfortunate because I wanted to buy into the time period and to the world. And there's so many reasons not to do this. There's so many distractions taking you straight out of it. One area we haven't looked at yet is warfare. There's not many parts in the film where I actually believe Odysseus and his crew are actually warriors. There's not a lot of scenes involving warfare besides the siege of Troy. When the Greek soldiers go up against the Cyclops or the giants, they pretty much just get their ass kicked. They're kind of cannon fodder, more or less. There's not too many examples in this film where I can say the fighting is accurate. Now, the one standout when it comes to the warfare and the fighting side of the film was Matt Damon and his use of the bow. You can definitely tell he had trained quite extensively. The way he holds it, the way he strings the bow, and that's obviously a big part of Odysseus' character. Him and the bow are one and the same. He's the only person that can fire his bow, and I really do feel like when Penelope hands him the bow, that was really his. When he is cutting down the suitors and how he manages to take so many out, I think was also pretty accurate because these guys are a bunch of freeloaders. They're not warriors. They're not battle-hardened veterans like Odysseus. They haven't been at war for 10 years, so it is believable that a guy with that experience could probably cut down a lot of essentially fuckboys trying to eat him out of house and home. Especially Antonius. He's all bark, no bite. But unfortunately, that does take the tension away a little bit because you kind of know that he's going to come out on top because when he does fight Antonius, it's not really much of a fight. Now, Telemachus, when he's fighting, what's his name, Melanaussus, whatever his name is, in the storeroom is a bit more intense because Telemachus does get his ass kicked quite a lot. And when he does finally take down his foe, it's more of a lucky shot than anything else. But when it comes to the crew, they don't seem like the most competent bunch of warriors when it comes to weapons. As I mentioned, there's not many examples in the film where they actually really get to use them competently because they're always fighting monsters and getting their ass kicked. But where were the shields? I thought Greek warfare had a lot to do with shields. The phalanx, the Spartans' famous shield wall. I know this is a different time period, but they still did have shields. You would have thought a couple of them would have gone ashore with a shield because that was one of the most primary tools of warfare back then, was a sword and a shield, or a spear and a shield. Swords were a bit expensive. Spears were the main weapon of the day, so a spear and a shield is what I would expect from his crew, but none of them really have shields. They've all got these swords that hang off a sheath attached to a belt around their waist. There's no curved blades. They're all very straight looking swords. Because during that period of time, swords weren't really that good, especially Bronze Age swords. They were pretty shit. They used to bend out of shape all the time. You were constantly having to bend them back into shape and sharpen them up. The spear, the bow, an axe were far better weapons. And most of the time, the swords were so blunt they didn't break the skin. They would just break the bone. The bone marrow would mix in with the blood, and then you'd die of sepsis. It wasn't really the nicest period. More people died from infection and broken bones than they did from the actual weapons. But that's not to say there could have been a bit more realism throughout the film. Like I've mentioned before, there's not a lot of blood. When he's cutting down the suitors, it's kind of like a popcorn film. He's just shooting them, they get hit once and they go down. No one's screaming or rolling around in pain. They've got arrows sticking out of them and they all apparently just die nice and cleanly on the floor. And when you look at the design of the palace, especially the banquet room, there's a gutter system that runs down the middle of the room with water. That would have been the perfect scene to have a couple of dead suitors and the blood going into the water and running down towards the camera. That would have been the perfect visual metaphor for cleansing the house. The master is back and the sickness is going to be purged. There's a few opportunities like that Nolan could have really capitalized on to make a far bigger impact. Odysseus is cutting people down with a bow. He's fighting people with a sword, stabbing people in the feet with an arrow. He's getting attacked with spears, and you don't really feel the impact of that. There's not a lot of blood. It doesn't really look like anyone's getting hurt. And once again, this scene is very darkly shot, so it is kind of hard to tell. When the Greek soldiers do encounter the Cyclops or the giants, they get their asses kicked. As soon as the fight begins, they panic, they run off, and then they just get cut down. So they're pretty much glorified cannon fodder. It would have been a much better scene if Odysseus orders them all to form up with the shield and then take on the giants. It would have been far more dramatic, but no, the giants just come out of the mist, cut everyone to pieces, and then they run off down the sloping forest towards the beach and get on the boats. I think the biggest criticisms I do have with the geography of the film is it just looks so cold. It looks so different to how Greece looks. If you Google a picture of Ithaca, it's a green, lush, warm-looking place. Odysseus' palace looks like it's built on top of this very cold-looking mountain. It's got wind-swept fields, and it looks like it's freezing fucking cold. It doesn't resemble the Mediterranean that well. And that's what I also don't understand, is because Christopher Nolan's gone to all this effort to film it in IMAX. Wouldn't that be the perfect chance to shoot the Mediterranean with an IMAX camera? It would have looked stunning. Imagine seeing the turquoise water, the green vegetation, and those limestone cliffs in all that 70mm glory. But no, we get desolate beaches, snowy forests, windswept hills, and geography that looks more like Scotland and Wales than it does the Mediterranean. And going back to Calypso's island too, it's such a barren, desolate looking place. In Homer's version, she lives on an island in a cave. In this version, she's basically like an ancient vagrant, pretty much. There's nothing enticing about the island, not a lot to want to keep someone there for 7 years. It's a very barren, desolate looking beach. I mean, on the one hand, there is the water over the sand. There's this shallow water on the sand, but it goes on for miles and miles. I don't know where they filmed that, but it's a very bleak looking place. You have that blue water, then everything else is just sand. There's no geographical landmarks. There's no green. There's no cave. There's like a rickety looking shelter made out of wicker. And I just don't get why he chose to make the island look so inhospitable. The whole point was Calypso was supposed to be hospitable, was feeding him the lotus to keep him to stay. At night, he returns to the cave to make love to the goddess. So there had to be this anchor thing for him, for Odysseus wanting to stay, the beauty of the goddess, and he has everything he needs on this island. He didn't have to go hunting. Everything was provided, and this island doesn't have a lot to provide it one person with, let alone two. I've noticed this in other Christopher Nolan films as well. He likes these very bleak backgrounds. He likes, I guess it's him showing the scope and scale of things by not having a lot of landmarks or mountains or buildings or anything like that in the frame. He does this with Dunkirk, showing the expanse of the water. I just think he missed a golden opportunity to really make something very special with those IMAX cameras, shooting the Mediterranean in IMAX. I guess he does do that, but as I said before, the shots on the beaches of Troy with the Trojan horse sticking out of the sand, it's a wooden statue of a horse in the sand, and there's not a lot else behind it. It's very dramatic on one hand, but it's also very minimalist. And maybe that's what he was going for. I just can't help but think it would have been better if it was a bit more brighter, a bit more colourful, and a bit more lively, if it actually felt like an alive environment rather than a desolate wasteland. Because some of the locations in this wouldn't have been out of place in Dune or Mad Max. Especially Dune, when he's walking along that beach, it literally looks like a scene from Dune 3. So now we move on to the biggest elephant in the room regarding this film, and that is race, realism, and authenticity. What world is Christopher Nolan trying to create? One of the biggest discussions surrounding the Odyssey has not simply been about the story, the performances, or the filmmaking. It's been about the representation. And this is where I think we need to have a more interesting conversation than simply asking whether a casting choice is good or bad. Because there has been plenty of that going around the internet over the past couple of months. It has been a very driving force around the criticism of this film. Lupita Nyong'o as Helen has been the most controversial choice, and Elliot Page. But across the board, I don't think this film was very well cast at all. I think there could have been some better casting choices. And I'm not just talking about the controversial ones. I think Odysseus could have probably been someone other than Matt Damon. I would have actually liked to have seen fresh faces brought to this world. As I mentioned before, James Cameron has done this in the past, but Nolan tends to go for a celebrity-stacked film, whether this is just to get people in the door, because the subject matter is ancient Greece, it's a 3-hour film, doesn't always appeal to everybody. I think a lot of people are seeing this film because it's got Nolan's name attached to it. I think this film would have really benefited from a couple of unknowns or up-and-coming actors who were seeking their shot. While Tom Holland does a good job of Telemachus, this role could have easily gone to an up-and-coming actor. Same with Odysseus, I think. And obviously you do need some star power when you're going to make a film this large. Matt Damon, he was good as Odysseus, but he was good. He kind of felt like I said before, he feels like Matt Damon playing Matt Damon. There's probably about a dozen actors that probably could have played Odysseus. Same goes for Penelope. I think Calypso, I think she should have been played by probably somebody younger. That's not to sound ageist against Charlize, but I think someone like Sydney Sweeney or Margot Robbie would have been a better choice. Margot Robbie would have been a great Helen of Troy, as I explained before. She represents more of the qualities of Helen. I'm not just looking at skin tone. She represents more of the classical interpretation. Well, not so much the classical interpretation, but she embodies more of the qualities of Homer's Helen. And that's just a personal opinion too. I like Margot Robbie. So is that my own prejudices casting an actress due to what I find physically attractive? At the same time, she is described as having fair hair, pale arms. I think if you're going to go with Diane Kruger in Troy, Margot Robbie probably would have been a good follow-up. If you asked the male population who was more attractive just based on looks, they're probably going to pick Margot Robbie over Lupita Nyong'o. And that's not saying that Lupita Nyong'o is unattractive. She's not. She's a very beautiful woman. I just don't think she captures the essence or the qualities that make Helen so revered in the story. So this brings me down to the question I want to ask. When a filmmaker chooses to recreate an ancient world, what responsibility do they have to historical authenticity? Because the Odyssey is not set in a fantasy world. It's set in a very real time period, the late Bronze Age, ancient Greece, in the Mediterranean. It's a real time period, a real place. Most people know what the Mediterranean looks like. Christopher Nolan is not creating a new galaxy, a fictional kingdom, a new Middle-earth, or a world entirely of his own imagination. He's adapting one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, a story that is rooted in a specific time, involving specific cultures, and a very specific civilization. And that world of Homer is the world of the late Bronze Age. The Aegean, Mycenaean kingdoms, ancient rituals, warrior kings, sailors, gods, and a society built around the ideas of honor, hospitality, reputation, and family. So for me, this discussion isn't about whether an actor is talented. It isn't about whether someone from a particular background can play a role. The question is, does the creative choice strengthen the world being created, or does it pull the audience away from the world Nolan is trying to sell the audience? This is the same standard we apply to every other historical production. If a filmmaker creates a movie about ancient Rome, audiences expect to see Roman architecture, Roman clothing, Roman politics, and a society that feels connected to that historical time period. Now, if a filmmaker creates a movie about medieval Japan, audience expect the world, customs, and visual language, and also the casting, to reflect that setting. You're not going to cast Sylvester Stallone as a shogun or a Japanese samurai because it would not be fucking believable. Now, a good example of this is The Last Samurai, because people will make the argument, well, Tom Cruise is playing a samurai. Tom Cruise is playing a Western warrior who is at odds with his own culture, who takes an opportunity to travel abroad to a completely alien culture to his own. Things don't go his way. He's captured by the samurai, and he ends up falling in love with this alien culture and adopting their ways. He's not really a samurai, but he has become a part of the samurai culture, because the rest of the casting in the film is mainly Japanese actors. You didn't have Ken Watanabe's character played by Brad Pitt, because it wouldn't be believable. Now, if the story involves an outsider, a Westerner, anyone really who travels to another land or is shipwrecked somewhere in a far-off alien civilization. That's a completely different story. If Tom Cruise washes up on a beach in Japan and is found by a local Japanese fisherman and he ends up staying there and becoming integrated into the culture, that's a far different story from someone trying to play an ancient Greek who is, let's say, for example, from Iceland or something like that. And look, you can play with certain parts of history. Obviously, no one really knows what history was like. So it's up to the filmmakers and the creatives to take some creative liberties somewhere, but respect the overall time period overall. Ridley Scott does this with Gladiator. Now, you can argue that they're not probably 100% time period correct Roman armour and clothing, but it's pretty damn close. Hollywood Romans always wear red cloth. In reality, they wore whatever they could get their hands on, wherever they happened to be in whatever part of the world. They used to wear blue, yellow, green, brown. Hollywood just seems to associate red with Rome. Now, Russell Crowe's character, Maximus, looks like a believable Roman general, or how we would expect a Roman general to dress and act. Now, to some people in the audience, maybe Matt Damon and his crew look like ancient Greeks, but to anyone who knows anything about history, they do not. There's too many creative liberties and pulling from too many aspects of different time periods to make the Odyssey 100% believable. Now, like I said, you can be creative. Ridley Scott does this with Gladiator, with the quadruple crossbow? We know that didn't exist, but it looks cool as hell during a fight. But you can forgive that creative choice if the rest of the film is authentic. And that's why Gladiator works, because it is more authentic. Yeah, maybe the Colosseum was a bit more colourful, maybe it was painted, maybe it looked slightly different. But enough time and care has gone into try to create a believable, lived-in ancient Rome. The second one does a similar thing. It's more colourful than the first, especially with Denzel Washington's character and some of the senators that will wear very colourful robes and togas, which I think is more correct to the time period than everyone just wearing white. Once again, Hollywood does form a lot of people's opinions about ancient history and ancient cultures. But for the most part, Ridley Scott does a pretty good job of correct time period. Even though the armour might have been a little different here and there, it still captures the idea and the world of ancient Rome. The same is true for The Last Samurai. Not once do you not believe you're in ancient Japan. If we look at fantasy films that are set in like a medieval time period, like Lord of the Rings, we buy into them because the world feels so real, it feels lived in, and it feels believable. The orcs feel real, the Uruk-hai feel real, the humans, the elves. Not once does it feel corny or lame, because the care has gone into building this believable world. And as we all know, historical fiction always involves some type of interpretation, some creative license here and there. But the details do matter, because they create the illusion that we are witnessing another time and place, or another world. And this is one of the reasons films like Star Wars work so well, is because George Lucas understood the importance of creating a lived-in and believable world. The Millennium Falcon looks worn in, the technology looks used, the environments look like they existed before the camera arrived. And when we compare Star Wars, and I know it's science fiction, and science fiction fantasy, but if we compare Star Wars to other 70s sci-fi films, why is Star Wars the most popular? Because you believe Luke is a moisture farmer on a desolate planet seeking bigger things. The Millennium Falcon is beat to shit. If it was just pristine and clean and looked like a snap-together model, no one would believe it. And other sci-fi films, everything is clean, everyone is in these pristine environments, nothing feels used or dirty. It feels like a film set. It feels like you're supposed to buy into this illusion that these people are in space in a spaceship, but everything's brand new and clean and everything looks like they've just taken it from the prop department and stuck it together. Where Star Wars, everything feels old, ancient. It feels more like mythology than Nolan's Odyssey. Obi-Wan's robes are tattered and torn. The Millennium Falcon's all oily and beat up and dirty. Stormtroopers have scratches on their armour. They're not all pristine and white. The world feels real and lived in. The Mos Eisley Cantina feels like a real place. The halls of the Death Star, same thing. That feels like a real space station. And George Lucas paid a lot of time and attention to these to these very small details to make the world believable. And guess what? It works because the audience buys in, and they brought in big time with Star Wars because it's lasted nearly 50 years. People love it, and it spawned a fanatical fan base as a result. And that's why films like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings work, because people buy into the fantasy. The fantasy only works because the details make it believable. Historical epics face that exact same challenge. If you made Braveheart in Los Angeles, no one would believe it. If it wasn't cold and muddy and dirty and bloody, it wouldn't feel like medieval Scotland. Another example, Game of Thrones. Why does it work so well? Because it feels real and believable. You feel the Lannister dynasty. You feel like this family has been controlling this part of the world for hundreds of years. The dragons feel real. It's got all the same bullshit tropes and same cliche crap that every other medieval fantasy has. Dragons and prophecies and witches and warriors and monsters, but it still works. And why do these stories work? Because they make the audience, the reader, the viewer, the listener, buy into the world they're selling. There's plenty of examples of fantasy and science fiction films, books, TV shows that have failed because of the opposite reason. People don't buy in because they don't believe they were real to begin with. There's been heaps of historical films that have just been tossed in the bin because they don't feel real. Now, does anyone remember that film, The Eagle, with Channing Tatum and Donald Sutherland? It wasn't the worst film. I actually did enjoy it. But Donald Sutherland's got an American accent and he's playing a Roman senator. Channing Tatum does change his accent. He goes for more of the neutral accent. But that film is not remembered or held to the same level as a film like Gladiator, Braveheart, or Kingdom of Heaven. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad film or had bad performances. It just wasn't that authentic. It was authentic in some ways, but the accents do let that film down. And this is a huge problem of Nolan's The Odyssey. Another good example would be that French film, Joan of Arc. That movie is fucking incredible. The battles in that are some of the best I've ever seen. Because it feels dirty, lived in, it feels real. You can smell the scum and the blood and the dirt. Everyone looks filthy. You don't have all these pristine looking actors running around in clean armor. Everything feels real, dented, beat up, and used. Now, when you take those medieval films and they all have the shiny armor, no one really believes it. That Sean Connery, Richard Gere film from the mid-90s, that was it the King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table movie? Why does no one remember that? Because it was fucking crap, for one, even though it did have a decent cast. You had Sean Connery, Richard Gere, but on the other hand, it's not believable because all the knights, the whole world they're creating looks like the backlot of Universal Studios. The castles look like they're made out of cardboard and foam. But the biggest problem with that film, at least for me anyway, was the costume design. The costumes are terrible. The knights look like they're half fantasy knights from some type of third-tier knockoff of Lord of the Rings or something like that. And the other parts of the armor and the costumes that do resemble the medieval period look like they've been mismatched and picked from different time periods throughout the medieval period. And it's just not believable. And that's the biggest issue I have with the Odyssey. Well, one of the biggest issues anyway. Because the audience has to believe they have entered Homer's world, not Christopher Nolan's interpretation of Homer's world. Now, there is an important point to make about the ancient Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was never just an isolated world. It wasn't confined just to the coastline of Greece. It was a crossroads of civilizations. The Greeks traded, they fought, migrated, and interacted with peoples from across the region, including Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. It was a connected world. But connected does not mean identical. Every ancient civilization had its own history, culture, traditions, and identity. So the challenge for any adaptation set in this time period is finding the balance between artistic interpretation and historical credibility. And I think that's where Nolan really does lack, is the credibility of the world he's trying to sell, because there were so many times I'm just pulled out of this film because I'm thinking, why is Tom Holland and John Bernthal all of a sudden look like they're in Robin Hood and not the Odyssey? Why are they wearing long-sleeve hooded shirts with modern-looking armor with straight angles on it? And maybe that's just me because I am obsessed with details and history. To the average viewer, they might not care about that, but for a portion of the viewing audience, it doesn't feel real. And once again, Star Wars, everybody in the audience buys into George Lucas's world. You buy what he's selling because he's taken the time to make that 1%, 2%, 3% of the audience buy in. Now, going back to what Tarantino said about the law of averages, you want to play on that 75%. George Lucas and Star Wars goes far beyond that because he could have stopped. He didn't have to make everything look so real and dirty and used, but he takes the time and puts the effort in to get that other 25 to 30% on side to buy in, which is why it's stood the test of time. They look at a film like Titanic. James Cameron painstakingly recreated the Titanic in that time period as best as possible. There's not once in that film where you think, oh, that person didn't wear that kind of clothing, because he has been obsessive with the details. Every extra has a backstory. The plates were looked authentic. He recreated the wooden staircase. He built a facade of the ship. He recreated the dining rooms, the chairs, the clothing, the decks, the signs. Every part of that film feels 100% believable. In the words of John Hammond, they spared no expense getting you to buy into the fantasy that Cameron was selling. It does exactly the same thing with Avatar, just on a digital scale, but you don't question the world you're watching. Nothing feels artificial or like it shouldn't be there because the details have been attended to. And a filmmaker can absolutely make creative choices. That is part of the nature of storytelling. Nolan can take liberties, he can be creative, but audiences are also allowed to ask whether those choices support the story being told, or do they hinder it? Do they take you out of the story and even diminish it? And this brings us to the larger question about modern adaptations. Every generation retells ancient stories through its own values. That has always happened. The Romans interpreted Greek mythology through a Roman lens. The Renaissance rediscovered the classics through its own worldview. Modern filmmakers do exactly the same thing. So the question is not whether interpretation exists, because as we've just seen, it always has. The question becomes, at what point does reinterpretation begin to challenge the identity of the story itself? If the Romans had reinterpreted the Greek mythology too differently, if they put too much of their own Roman lens on it, it doesn't really become Greek mythology anymore. It becomes a hybrid of Roman-Greek mythology. In the Renaissance, if they rediscover the classics and change them to make them modern in their time period, that changes it again. And in my opinion, I think Nolan has changed the Odyssey way too much. It's too fucking modern. There's too much modern interpretation. Odysseus is an old soldier trying to make his way back home, suffering from PTSD, the side effects of a lifetime of war and his choices as a leader. It's more or less a story of a returned soldier struggling with his past, trying to find his way back home. You could have said it in the modern day and it probably would have been a better film. But choosing to focus on just the military PTSD side of Odysseus changes the character, because that's only a little part of what Homer's Odysseus goes through. It's a very small sliver of the character. He pays the price for his hubris, not because he made bad decisions because of PTSD or he was led astray by a hallucination of Athena. He completely changes it, and I don't think these changes were made for the better because it's too much of a modern interpretation. I don't get why you would go to all the time and effort to make a film based on Homer, then disregard 50% of what Homer tells us the story is supposed to be about. You can be creative in some regards, and with a film like the Odyssey, you have to, because it is such a hard story to tell, especially on the big screen. It probably would make a better TV show in a long format, a couple of seasons where you can really let the story breathe. But in a 2 hour and 52-minute film, there is a lot to squeeze in. So, from my perspective, the greatest adaptations are the ones that understand the original before they transform it. They know what made the story survive for thousands of years. They understand the values, the conflicts, and the worldview of the people who created it. Because the Odyssey is not simply a collection of adventures, it is a window into another civilization and another time period. And the challenge for any filmmaker is not just recreating what people look like, it is recreating how they saw the world. A good example of this is the 2004 film Troy. I did love the film. I've seen it many, many times. It's one of my favourites. While they did take some massive creative liberties and a lot of people didn't like it for those reasons, when you compare that with the modern version of the Odyssey, Troy doesn't look so bad. Now, for all its faults, and once again, the Iliad is a hard book to translate too, because the Iliad ends in Priam's tent. There is no Trojan horse in the Iliad, so you can't really make a movie called Troy based on the Trojan War and not have the Trojan horse in it. You need some climax, some way to end the film. Now, during this time period, everything was going realistic. People wanted realism because they've had enough of the fantasy and the over-the-top bullshit from the 90s and early 2000s films. So I can understand why the filmmakers wanted to tell a more realistic, grounded story. And that's very hard to do when you have gods interacting with warriors like Achilles or Ajax and Hector. It's hard to tell when the supernatural world of Homer is one and the same with the physical world. But I think Troy does a good job of separating that, and because the gods are mentioned quite a lot, there's lots of scenes with temples and statues, and when Briseis gets captured, she's a priestess or a priestess in training. There is a definite acknowledgement of the gods that they need to be respected and honoured. So that supernatural world, while it's not quite the same as the way Homer describes it, it still is honoured and incorporated into the story, where Nolan makes this much more ambiguous, because Athena is basically a head injury hallucination, or PTSD, a stress hallucination. She's not really a real god. The gods are mentioned, but no one really plays the gods, unlike a film like Clash of the Titans, when that is more of a fantasy version of... I guess it still classes as mythology, because even though it's not really based on mythology, some parts have been taken from the mythology, but it's more or less an ancient Greek tale fantasized or made mythological. The gods are very real people in that. Liam Neeson is a great choice to play Zeus, but you still do buy into the world, because it is this world of gods and men, the supernatural and the real world. There is no differentiation. The gods live up in Olympus, but they still interact with Perseus and other characters along the way. It wasn't the greatest of films, but I think what it did really well was create this world of men and gods, mortals and immortals, by including and incorporating them into the one believable world. One of the most questionable aspects of that film was Sam Worthington's number 2 buzz cut. But going back to Troy, the filmmakers do a good enough job getting you to buy in and believe the world that they're selling you. Not once do you really not believe Brad Pitt is Achilles or Eric Bana is Hector. Now, they might have taken the gods out of it, and they might have taken some creative liberties in the storytelling and changed a few things. One being Agamemnon and Menelaus getting killed and ending the film with the Trojan War. But at the same time, it's very hard to tell that story on the big screen if you're not going to include the Trojan horse. So I can understand why they did that. And unfortunately, that makes the Odyssey even more ambiguous, because kings are explained. There is a hierarchy between the nobles and the servants. It's not overly explained all that well. There is a big focus on family and hospitality, which are some of the core tenets of Homer's The Odyssey. The topic of religion isn't handled very well. There is one scene in Athena's temple where the suitors try to ambush and kill Telemachus, but that's about as much as the gods are really mentioned. Poseidon's mentioned, Zeus is mentioned, but they don't play large roles in the film compared to the books. Athena, like I mentioned a dozen times already, she's a head injury hallucination. She's not a real physical god. And I really did hate that, because that is such a huge part of the Odyssey. There's a lot of metaphors in Homer's work as well. There's a lot of lessons to be learned. There's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of metaphors that tell these stories. And obviously Homer wrote this during this ancient Greek period, so this is a world that was completely believable and real to him. I just don't think Nolan does a very good job of translating the gods and religion in the Odyssey, even though they do make up such a big part of it. Because as I mentioned earlier in the review, Odysseus is always giving respect to the gods before he feeds the crew or himself. And when you have a poster with a tagline like "Defy the Gods," it's a completely different Odysseus he's trying to sell, and it's just not what I'm believing. During the scenes with the storms on the high seas and things like that in the Odyssey, the crew do mention that this is a Poseidon or this is a Zeus, punishing us or whatever. So that is mentioned, but it's not like they're realistic. They're not like they're realistic beings. They're not played by anyone in particular. They're just mentioned as a part of the world, and they're not really well visualized like they are in the book. And obviously that's a creative choice that Nolan has made. He has chosen not to make the gods a big role in this film. Athena is the main one. She is pretty much the guide through the entire book and one of the first characters you come to meet. So Nolan has completely done the opposite of that and taken all of that supernatural stuff out of it, and that goes back to what I was saying about that tagline at the start of the film, a time of apparent magic. I just don't think he quite grasps how mythology works, what the purpose of it is. I think he is looking at it like, oh, it's just silly magic and superstition and the supernatural, rather than trying to incorporate it into a realistic ancient Greek world. And I think this extends into the casting as well, because Nolan's asking us to buy into his world, believe in the time period the film is set, but doesn't do a lot in the way to make it authentic. Now, if there was an explanation why there is a Korean Greek soldier, an Indian Greek soldier, an Irish Greek soldier, it would be easier to try to understand. But the fact that he has been so controversial and so creative with the casting really does make me think he is doing this. He made these changes just because of the DEI requirements for the Oscars. And now I know that extends to the cast as well as the crew, but is there a better explanation why he did race swap a lot of characters? Once again, if there's a good explanation why there's a Korean guy, look, I don't have any problem against the actors. I would have taken the job too. It's just unauthentic to the time period. And all the changes he's made seem to be pandering to a very specific woke agenda. And that's before we even get into probably the worst casting decision in the history of cinema, and that is Elliot Page. You cast a woman who turned into a man to play a Greek soldier. So what are you trying to say? Because you literally cast a man with no balls to play a Greek warrior who isn't even in the book, or a creation of Homer. So what the fuck are you doing? If it's not to piss people off, if it's not for diversity because you really want that next Oscar, what is it for? Have you been paid off by the woke studios to push this agenda so they can have a successful quote-unquote diverse film, and then they can turn around to the studios and go, see, under the right circumstances, the methodology works. If we have a good story and a good cast and a good director, we can push this woke bullshit in future movies, because so far the woke messaging in a lot of films has failed. Audiences reject it, and I think it is one of the most controversial parts of what Nolan did, because I can't buy into the world where you're literally including people from all over the world except Greeks, because there's hardly anyone in the film that actually looks like they're from the Mediterranean or from Greece, and apparently no Greeks worked on the film. So is Christopher Nolan racist by doing that? You've excluded the culture whose story you're using. There's like one extra that actually looks Greek, and this goes for the more European and the American cast as well, because Matt Damon looks like he hasn't seen the sun. It looks like his Odysseus has grown up in Boston and he hasn't spent 20 years lost on the Mediterranean. You could at least try to make him look a little more tan, or like they've seen the sun at some point in their life. Who really knows what the ancient Greeks looked like anyway? Going back to Troy, at least Brad Pitt has a tan. So you can at least believe his character has been outside for at least 2 weeks. Greek people, like any other nationality, there are variances in skin color and things like that. So who's to say they're all white or olive? Because even that is a massive stereotype. And we could go on and on and on and on and on and on about this debate. And I think I'm just going to leave it there and move on. So is Nolan's vision accurate to Homer? In short, no. I think about 50% of the poem survives. The plot is largely the same. The dialogue has been completely modernized, as well as the characters and the themes. The dialogue is one of the most disappointing aspects of the film. The modern use of language and words that the Greeks wouldn't have used, and just general modern language just doesn't really feel authentic to the time period. Like, would Odysseus scream, "Let's go," right before running to the ships? Probably not. There's a couple of other very modern phrases in there too. Because Nolan has taken a few things out of this, it does change the overall theme of the Odyssey, because in the poem and in the film, they're completely different narratives. While the overall plot is the same, cutting out certain characters does have a very dramatic effect on the outcome of the story, and specifically for characters like Odysseus, because he's a completely different character in the film than he is in the book. Now, the ending is more or less the same. The monsters are all included. Gods are largely omitted physically. Just one more thing I'll bring up while I remember it. If you've seen the interview where Lupita Nyong'o is criticising Homer, that very, very cringy interview she did with that fuckwit, one of the questions was, if you were sitting next to Homer, what would you say? And she said something really ignorant. Hey, Homer, how do you feel about how much screen time we've given to the women in this compared to how much time you've given them? Or something along those lines. Which is one of the biggest fucking lies I have ever heard. Because Christopher Nolan largely omits the female characters, really apart from Penelope. Helen's barely in it because she's not really in the poem at all, which is her character, so she has having a whinge that she wasn't in the film more. If that is the case, take it up with Christopher Nolan. He's the one that wrote and directed it, not Homer. You're literally picking on a guy that's been dead for 3,000 years. Really heroic. There are far more female characters in Homer's poems. There's another female character, the Princess Nausicaa, who isn't in Nolan's version. Athena is one of the main characters in the poem. Nolan largely omits her. He dramatically reduced the role of Athena in the film. She is one of the main characters in the book and guides both Telemachus and Odysseus. So if you have a problem with how much screen time is given to female characters, maybe you should take it up with Christopher Nolan, not Homer. Because Homer has far more female characters in his poem than Nolan has in his film. And far more screen time too. Or page time. And I think the points I made before really do affect the emotional tone of the film, because it wasn't really that emotional. The book is far more emotional. Odysseus sits crying on Calypso's beach every day, pining for home. He cries for his lost crew, as do all the crew whenever someone's killed. They start weeping and honouring the fallen. I didn't really find this movie very emotional. Anne Hathaway's about the only emotional anchor in it. Matt Damon does try, but unfortunately, because the character has been changed, the emotional tone has overall been changed as well. The journey is more or less the same. It follows the same set of adventures in the poem, but it's the modern interpretation that is a real issue. Nolan has made a very bold, creative, and deliberate choice to change and modernize parts of the story and a majority of the characters. And I don't think it improves the story. I think it actually diminishes Homer. It's disrespectful to the source material, and this is just my opinion, obviously. I'm a bit of a purist. But he does change, as I mentioned before, the tone and the core of Odysseus and the story by leaving these things out of it. He chooses to focus on this war, this returned soldier who's struggling with the past, and this PTSD narrative, rather than a man pining for home, the story of homecoming, genius without humility, and hubris, and all the other themes Homer gets across so perfectly. I think Nolan diminishes that and really fucks a lot of those points up, because Odysseus' ego does get him in trouble quite a bit. As smart as he is, the hubris does get him. Nolan's Odysseus is a man struggling with the past and coming to grips with what he has done in Troy. There's not a lot of hubris in that, because he cuts that scene out with the Cyclops. The underworld scene has changed, which completely does change the direction the character does go in. And that does change the themes of the overall film. There's still aspects of heroism and masculinity, family, honor, fate, free will, leadership, with religion mixed in, but they're vastly different to Homer's poem. I think there is a negative connotation to male masculinity in this film. Cersei's character is very anti-male. She's not so much in the poem, but the way she's written in the film, she criticizes and calls out men for being murderers and rapists, pretty much. And their natural condition is that of a swine. The family theme is still there. I think Nolan really does diminish heroism and the hero's journey, because it becomes more like he gets them into this situation, a bunch of people get killed, and now he's got another thing he's going to be traumatized for later on. In the poem, the crew is responsible for what happens to them just as much as Odysseus is. It's 50-50. The crew fuck up a lot and they anger the gods and they're punished for it, same as Odysseus. And I didn't really get the sense of fate in this because, once again, you've cut the gods out of it. So it makes it very hard to have Athena guide Odysseus in the right direction and pull him up when he's done the wrong thing if she's largely been written out of the story. And I don't think he really gets religion and mythology all that well. So does the film interpret Bronze Age values through a modern lens? I think the film tries to reinvent what they think the Bronze Age and its values actually are by replacing elements with the modern day, because let's not forget, the Bronze Age is not the modern day, as we all know. They did things differently. They had different expectations. They obviously did things differently. They had a different outlook on the world, which they see the world through the gods, which is largely cut out, as I keep saying. Because to a modern audience, the violence at the end of the film and the poem is shocking, but through a Bronze Age lens, it's pretty warranted. You disrespect another man's house, you eat his food, you violate that sacred hospitality law, you will be punished for it. I think a few of the themes have been very heavily watered down in this. And that brings up the other question. Does Nolan look at the philosophical side of Greek mythology? No, I don't think he does. I don't think he really understands the nostos, the homecoming aspect. Well, I think he does to some degree, but the way he goes about it in his version is vastly different to the poem. Glory is largely looked at negatively, I'd say, in the film. The Kelos, honor, time, hospitality, Xena, those themes are in it. Time definitely does play a huge part of this film, as he likes to play with. I'd say glory has largely been downplayed because Odysseus can be very arrogant and glory hungry, or glory seeking. He pays for this humility, obviously, but he doesn't seem to care so much in the poem that he was the guy that sacked the city of Troy, where Matt Damon's Odysseus carries the weight of that. He doesn't see it as a glorious victory the same way Homer's Odysseus does. Divine justice is obviously a huge theme, and I think Nolan does get that right with the Massacre of the Suitors. He does touch upon the suffering aspect, but I'm not sure it translates as well in the film compared to the poem, because Odysseus does suffer quite a lot in the poem, and you can understand why, because of the hubris. Nolan's Odysseus is more or less surviving the journey rather than learning the lesson from it. He hasn't really learnt the nostos of the journey, and I think he fundamentally tells a completely different story. It's the plot, it's the narrative of Homer's Odyssey, but it's been interpreted through a very modern lens that focuses on, I'd say, a Western, nearly a US soldier's homecoming story. A guy that has PTSD, he carries the scars of war with him back home on a very long and drawn-out journey. And this brings me to the final verdict of the film. I'm going to be scoring the film in 8 separate categories and giving my overall rating at the end. It's a bit different to the way I usually rate films. Overall, the acting was pretty good. I thought the standout for me personally was Anne Hathaway, John Leguizamo, however you pronounce his name, and Tom Holland was by far the most surprising. Anne Hathaway and Tom Holland are the closest to the characters to the book. These are obviously the most close characters in the poem. They're mother and son. I thought Tom Holland was the most like Homer's Telemachus. His character doesn't really change that much. I have seen other versions. I watched, as I mentioned in part 1, I watched The Return with Ralph Fiennes, and the Telemachus character in that is much different. He's a much more aggressive and arrogant young man, although he doesn't really look that young in the film. I thought Tom Holland does get the innocent son searching for his father, but he also has that smart, cunning side that I think gets lost in other translations. Matt Damon as Odysseus, he was good. I mean, it's a great performance. I just don't quite buy him as Odysseus overall. And this is half Damon's fault and half Nolan's fault because the character has been changed. It's just the accent, just some of the things he does. I think there could have been better choices for Odysseus, but overall Matt Damon does a very good job. Cinematography is great. There's nothing I can really fault the cinematography for. It's a big Nolan film. There's some very stunning visual shots in this. As stupid as I think it is with the horse sinking in the sand, cinematography-wise, that does work. It is really, really good. I didn't see it in IMAX, but it does get a bit dark, especially especially the scenes in the palace. It looks dark and cold, and it can be very hard to see, especially especially the fight with Odysseus and the suitors. So for acting, I would give 4 out of 5. Cinematography, 5 out of 5. Music was up and down. I did like the traditional instruments, the harp and the gongs, but then I think it kind of gets ruined with the synthesizer because it doesn't make any sense to have a modern instrument when you're trying to stick to this traditional sounding score. It's one of those moments where you kind of like scratch your head and go, what is the point of the synthesizer? I understand it for the siren song and some parts like that, but ultimately it was very distracting because I'm trying to listen to the music, and then you hear the synthesizer kind of like coming up from the bottom of the mix, and it just takes you out of the time period again. And you start to think, am I watching a modern version of the Odyssey, or is this set 3,500 years ago? Why go to all the effort to make a film like that, to have Nolan say, well, I want you to use traditional instruments because they didn't have orchestras 3,000 years ago, go buy a whole bunch of gongs and harps only to use synthesizers? It kind of feels like you're defeating the purpose. I think it would have been much more creative to stick to a handful of ancient instruments. Production value, outstanding. There's so many physical props. They built real ships, even if they do look like Viking ships. There's a real horse. The city of Troy looks like it's made out of stone. Odysseus' palace looks incredible. Historical accuracy, on the other hand, very poor. I don't think there is much historical accuracy to this film at all, or Homeric accuracy for that matter. The historical accuracy was just all over the place. It was picking from too many different time periods, and I think it loses its identity because it is so loose in what it chooses to take from certain periods of time. Themes, yeah, I think he could have done a better job with the themes because, once again, they're too modernized, and it does take away from the original themes. Overall, it was a big, bold, but ultimately dull, lifeless, and emotionless epic. It's not an epic in the classic sense of the word. I think it's Christopher Nolan attempting to make a modern version of an epic. I think Nolan was aware that he was making a Christopher Nolan film, and I think there's a fair degree of pretentiousness that has gone along with that. I think he's kind of believing his own hype at this point. I think he got too creative with some of his choices, a little too bold. He generally thought he could get away with it and no one was going to say anything because he's Nolan and he can't do any wrong. So acting, I'd give 4 stars, cinematography 5, music 3, production design 5, historical accuracy 1, Homeric accuracy 1, themes 2.5. Overall, I'd give the film 3 stars out of 5, probably 3.5 if I'm being really generous, because it is ultimately a big, bold film, but unfortunately I think it is a Marvel interpretation of mythology for a modern audience that doesn't really have the attention span to really look into or appreciate real Greek mythology. It's vanilla ice cream for the lobotomized Marvel movie generation. So unfortunately, I think I have to give this film 3 stars because Nolan has said very contradictory points about this film before it was released. He said he was going to be authentic to the source material, and I just don't think he does it justice. So before I end the show, we're going to have a look at some quotes from Christopher Nolan on bringing audiences into Homer's world. This is a quote from Rolling Stone Australia. "This is a world where people saw gods in everything. So the thunder, the tides coming in, the winds blowing, that's all evidence of divinity. We're trying to take the audience and put them in that world. Not sure he really succeeds because he does diminish the role of the gods. After Oppenheimer was such a success, we had the opportunity to do the Odyssey, Los Angeles Times. It's a very bold choice, both huge films. There are parallels between both of them if you really want to look into it." And this is his quote regarding earthly narratives. This is from the Los Angeles Times also. "I wanted an earthly narrative." Yeah, I think he kind of gets that. But was Homer actually earthy? Or is he simultaneously mythological and supernatural? And I think that's where a bit of the conflict between Homer and Nolan has occurred, because you favoured an earthy tone in a very supernatural mythological story. And I think he's kind of maybe overlooked certain parts of the supernatural in favour of this earthly, a more realistic vision. But even though this is a story that does have monsters and cyclopses and whirlpools in them and giants, how realistic can you actually be? This is a quote from Matt Damon. about reading the script. This comes from a Rotten Tomatoes editorial. I don't know how the hell we're going to do this. Tom Holland on filming it. This is from Variety Australia. The job of a lifetime. Interesting. On the finished film, it's unlike anything I've ever seen before. Yeah, I doubt it. I've seen films that are far better and far worse. And to mimic Nolan's symmetrical ending style, I'll end the episode with the tagline of the film, Defy the Gods. It's probably the most controversial line in the marketing and promotion, and it does raise a lot of questions. Is this a metaphorical statement? Is it simply a marketing and promotional tool? Is this Homer? Is it anti-Homer? Is it subvertive? Does the film support the tagline? And ultimately, I think, yeah, it does. It defies the gods when Homer's Odysseus does not. But having said that, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey will undoubtedly introduce millions of people to Homer's epic. And maybe it will get people reading and studying Homer again and appreciating Homer's epics the way he envisioned them. But how close did Hollywood come to the original? That question deserves more than just a film review. It deserves an investigation. And I think we'll leave it there and we'll pick it up in the next installment. Homer versus Hollywood. We'll be looking at the various translations of Homer's work, how each translation differs from one another and can mean something else, and why this matters in terms of which interpretation Nolan chose to base the film on. And then we'll be moving on to have a look at the world of Homer, oral poetry, the late Bronze Age, Greek mythology, and a whole lot more. And that brings the Epic Odyssey review to an end. A big thank you to everyone who made it to the end, and I mean it because it's a long episode that I had to split into two parts. I've never had to split a film review into two parts before, but there was a lot to cover, and I still don't think I've covered everything, but I think I have to stop at some point, otherwise I'm going to be talking for the next 15 episodes about things I did or didn't like about the film. So a big thank you for everyone who made it to the end. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned something from it, and stick around for future installments. If you would like to support the True Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. You can head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. You can check out the True Tank store over on Spring. You can pick yourself up some merch, support the show, and you will look really cool doing it. If merch isn't your thing, you can head on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page. You can make a one-off donation of your choosing, $10, $1, $100, whatever you think the show is worth, or a recurring monthly payment. Both links are in the show notes and my social media bios. You can download and listen to the True Tank on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Podbean, Audible, Amazon Music, Castbox, iHeartRadio, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread it around and get the True Tank out there. If you're enjoying the show, why not leave a 5-star rating and review on your preferred platform? Every review helps the show grow and get found, and I'll be back in the next week or two with another epic installment of our deep dive into the world of Homer, or another film review if I haven't completed the next installment on Homer. But until then, I'm a Tank. This is the truth to tell.